Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still don't sleep well in January. It's been 17 years since that night. But every time the temperature drops and the wind picks up, I'm right back there on that four-wheeler with my brother, staring at something that shouldn't exist. I guess I should start at the beginning. My name's Olivia, and back in January 2006, my older brother Mason and I were living with our parents in southwest Washington near the Williper Hills. I was 19 then, home from my first semester at college, and Mason was 23. We'd grown up riding ATVs all over our property and the surrounding areas since we were kids. Our parents owned about 40 acres that backed up to thousands of acres of undeveloped wetlands and forest. Most locals knew the land was a maze of old logging roads, dikes and trails that were built decades ago to manage the seasonal flooding. That January evening started like any other winter day. It had been cold, probably in the low 30s. And we'd had a light snow the day before, maybe 2 or 3 inches. Nothing major, but enough to dust everything. Mason had this beat-up Yamaha four-wheeler that we'd take out all the time. He'd just put a new headlight on it and wanted to test it out, so around 7 in the evening, we bundled up and headed out. I remember the cold air burning my lungs as we rode. I was wearing my dad's old hunting jacket, a wool hat pulled down over my ears, and these thick gloves that made it hard to grip the sides of the ATV. Mason was driving, and I sat behind him, arms wrapped around his waist. The only sounds were the engine rumbling beneath us, and our breath fogging in the night air. We followed our usual route, cutting through the back of our property and onto the network of dikes that ran through the wetlands. These dikes were basically raised dirt roads, about 8 feet wide, built to control water levels. In winter, they were the only way to navigate through the flooded areas. Water on both sides, forest in the distance. The dikes created this weird grid pattern across the landscape. The four-wheeler's single headlight carved a tunnel through the darkness. It was around 8 or 8:30 by then. No moon that night, just pitch black beyond our light. The snow reflected the beam, making the path ahead glow slightly. I remember feeling peaceful despite the cold. Mason and I didn't talk much as we rode. The engine was too loud, and honestly, we didn't need to. We'd done this 100 times before. We were maybe 3 miles from home, moving along one of the straighter dikes, when Mason suddenly slowed down. Not abruptly, just easing off the gas, so we gradually lost speed. "What's up?" I leaned forward and asked into his ear. He didn't answer, just pointed ahead. At first I thought maybe a tree had fallen across the path or something, but then I saw movement. Something was crossing the dike ahead of us, maybe 50 yards out. My first thought was deer, but I realized immediately it wasn't that. It was walking on 2 legs. My second thought was hiker, but that made no sense. Nobody hiked out here, especially not at night in January. Plus, it was too big to be a person. Way too big. Mason cut the engine. The headlight was still on, pointing directly at whatever was crossing the dike. Without the engine noise, the silence was absolute. Just our breathing and the faint sound of wind rustling through the dead winter reeds. That's when I got my first clear look, and 17 years later, I can still see it perfectly. The thing was enormous. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8. It was covered in hair, this light brownish color that moved in the wind. The hair was long, maybe 4 to 6 inches, and it rippled as it walked. Where the hair moved, you could see lighter skin underneath, especially along its side. It stepped out from the right side of the dike, paused for a moment right in the middle, and then continued to the left. Its movements were fluid, smooth, not lumbering or awkward like you might expect from something that big. It took these wide, heavy strides, covering the 8-foot width of the dike in what seemed like 2 steps. When it paused in the middle, it turned slightly toward our light. I couldn't make out its face clearly, it was partially shadowed. But I could see its upper body in detail. The shoulders were incredibly broad, the chest was massive, with less hair there, and I swear I could see muscles moving under the skin. Its arms were unnaturally long, swinging as it walked with a heaviness that just screamed power. The craziest part, it didn't seem alarmed or even interested in us. It just continued on its way. No hurry, no hesitation. Like crossing paths with a 4-wheeler and 2 humans was completely normal. It stepped off the dike and disappeared into the darkness of the woods on the other side. Mason and I sat there frozen. I don't know how long, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. I couldn't feel my fingers gripping his jacket anymore. My breath was making these little white clouds that seemed to hang in the air forever. "Did you?" Mason finally whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't finish the question. "Yeah," I said. "I saw it." "We should go back," he said. But he didn't start the engine. Instead, he slowly put the 4-wheeler into neutral, and we rolled a little closer to where the thing had crossed. We stopped about 20 feet from where it had been. "I want to look," he said, and before I could stop him, he was off the ATV walking toward the crossing point. "Mason," I hissed, "what the hell are you doing?" "I just want to see," he said, his voice unsteady. He pulled out the small maglite he always kept in his jacket pocket. I got off too, more because I was terrified of being left alone on the 4-wheeler than from any desire to investigate. My legs felt like rubber as I followed him. The snow made everything easier to see. And there they were, footprints. Not just any footprints. They were enormous, easily 15 to 16 inches long, human-shaped but wider, with 5 distinct toes. The stride between them was insane, at least 4 feet apart. And they were deep, pressed maybe 2 inches into the snow and underlying mud, which meant whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Mason crouched down next to one of the prints. He put his gloved hand next to it for scale, and his hand looked child-sized in comparison. He shined his flashlight into the forest where the thing had disappeared, but the beam only penetrated maybe 15 feet before being swallowed by darkness. "We need to go," I said, grabbing his arm. "Now, Mason." He nodded, still staring at the footprint. Yeah, we should." The ride back was a blur. Mason drove faster than he should have on the icy dikes. Neither of us spoke. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see that thing following us, but there was only darkness. When we got home, we didn't tell our parents. What would we say? "Hey, we just saw Bigfoot?" They'd think we were crazy or playing a prank, so we didn't say anything to anyone. The next day, Mason wanted to go back in the daylight to take pictures of the footprints, but it snowed another 3 inches overnight. When we returned, the tracks were covered. Part of me was relieved. Without evidence, it was easier to convince myself that maybe we'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs or something. Except I knew that wasn't true. Bears don't walk 50 yards on 2 legs. They don't have shoulders like that. They don't move like that. For years afterward, Mason and I barely discussed what we saw. We had this unspoken agreement not to bring it up. I think we were both afraid, not of the creature exactly, but of what it meant. If that thing was real, what else might be out there that we don't know about? It wasn't until about 5 years ago that Mason finally brought it up again. We were at his place for Thanksgiving, and after everyone else went to bed, we stayed up drinking beer on his back porch. He asked me if I still thought about that night. I admitted I did. "I looked it up," he said. "There have been other sightings in the Williper Hills, going back decades." I wasn't surprised. What we saw moved with too much purpose, too much familiarity with the terrain. It belonged there. We were the intruders. The strangest part of the whole experience was how uninterested it seemed in us. It wasn't aggressive or even curious. It was just going somewhere, doing whatever it normally does on cold January nights when humans aren't around. I've gone back to those wetlands many times since then, always in daylight, always with other people. I've never seen anything like that again. But sometimes when I'm out there, I get this feeling of being watched, not in a threatening way, more like I'm being observed with the same casual indifference that creature showed us that night. I've read a lot about Sasquatch encounters since then. Most reports describe creatures running away or hiding. Some describe aggressive behavior, but what sticks with me about our encounter was how mundane it seemed, like crossing paths with a neighbor while getting the mail. No big deal, just two different species momentarily sharing the same space. That's what keeps me up at night in January, not fear that the creature might come looking for me, but the realization that while we drive our ATVs and build our houses and think we know everything about our world, there are things living alongside us that we know nothing about. Things that know how to stay hidden, how to avoid us, how to exist in the spaces we overlook. Mason and I don't talk about it much anymore. He's moved to Oregon now, has a family, but every January, without fail, he texts me the same message. Sleep tight. Don't let the Sasquatch bite. It's his way of acknowledging what we experienced, of telling me I'm not crazy for still thinking about it. I'm 36 now, and I've never told this story publicly before. I don't have proof. I don't have pictures. All I have is what Mason and I saw that night. A creature at least 7 feet tall, covered in light brown hair, walking confidently across a dike in the middle of nowhere on a cold January night. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers us too. If somewhere in the Williper Hills, that creature occasionally thinks about the 2 humans it saw that night, sitting frozen on their noisy machine, their single eye of light casting shadows across the snow. Probably not. We were likely just another moment in its day, as forgettable to it as passing a stranger on the street is to us. But I remember. God, do I remember. And on cold January nights when the wind blows, I still find myself looking out the window, half expecting to see a tall figure standing at the edge of the yard, hair moving in the breeze, watching me with that same casual indifference. Story 2. I've been struggling with whether to share this experience for a long time now. 15 years have passed, but I still get chills when I think about it. I'm not the type of person who jumps at shadows or believes every bump in the night is something supernatural. I'm actually pretty skeptical by nature. I need evidence before I believe in anything. But what happened to my cousin and me back in the summer of 2008 has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about what lives in our forests. It was supposed to be just a normal camping trip. My extended family tries to get together every summer for at least one big outdoor adventure. That year, we settled on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. If you've never been there, it's this incredible mix of mountains, rainforest, and coastline. Some of the trees are absolutely massive, and the forest is so dense in places that even on sunny days, it can feel like dusk under the canopy. We were a pretty big group. My parents, my sister Amanda, my aunt and uncle, their kids, including my cousin Michael, and a couple of family friends. 12 people in total. Most of us had grown up camping, so we were comfortable with the outdoors, though this was definitely more remote than our usual spots. The particular campground we chose required a hike in from the trailhead, about 3/4 of a mile through dense forest. It was nothing extreme, but far enough that you couldn't see or hear the parking area once you reached camp. We arrived later than planned that Friday afternoon. The sun was already getting low, and by the time we parked and started unloading our gear, we knew we'd be setting up camp in the dark. Everyone was eager to get to the site and set up tents before it got completely dark, so the group sort of naturally split up. Most people grabbed what they could carry and started up the trail immediately. I stayed behind at the trailhead to inflate an air mattress. I have a bad back, and sleeping directly on the ground is miserable for me. My parents had this battery-operated pump that made a horrible whining noise, and I didn't want to disturb everyone at camp with it later. Michael, my cousin, had helped me unload some gear, and once we had everything sorted, he decided to head up to the campsite ahead of me. "I'm going to start walking up," he told me. "You good here by yourself?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, fighting with the pump attachment. "This should only take a few minutes. I'll catch up." I stayed focused on my task, not thinking much about Michael heading off alone. It was still light enough to see the trail clearly, and besides, we'd hiked together countless times before. He was 24 at the time, athletic, and knew his way around the outdoors. About 20 minutes later, I finally finished inflating the mattress, packed it away, and started up the trail myself. By this point, twilight had settled in. The forest was taking on that bluish-grey quality that happens just before true darkness. The trail was pretty straightforward, a dirt path that wound uphill through massive trees with ferns and underbrush on either side. I didn't think much about Michael during my hike. I assumed he was already at camp helping set things up. I did notice how quiet it was, though. Other than my own footsteps crunching on the occasional twig or patch of gravel, there was an eerie stillness to the forest. No bird calls, no distant sounds of other campers. It felt almost unnaturally quiet, but I chalked it up to the dense tree canopy absorbing sound. When I finally reached camp, everyone was busy setting up tents or starting a fire. Michael was helping my uncle with one of the larger tents, but I immediately noticed something was off about him. His face was pale, and he seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the woods surrounding our campsite. I dropped my gear next to our family's tent spot and went over to help. "Everything okay?" I asked him quietly. He just shook his head slightly. "I'll tell you later." The rest of the evening proceeded normally. We got camp set up, ate a simple dinner of sandwiches and chips since it was too late for anything elaborate, and eventually gathered around the campfire. It wasn't until most people were heading to their tents for the night that Michael pulled me, Amanda, and a couple of others aside. "Something weird happened on my walk up here," he said, his voice low. He kept glancing around, as if worried about being overheard, not by the rest of our group, but by something else. "What do you mean?" Amanda asked. Michael took a deep breath. "When I was walking up the trail, after Catherine stayed behind with the air mattress, I felt like I was being followed." One of our friends laughed. "Dude, we were all on the same trail. You probably heard some of us ahead of you." Michael shook his head emphatically. "No, it wasn't that. Everyone else was way ahead. Something was walking parallel to me in the woods beside the trail." I remember feeling a little chill at his words, but still wasn't particularly alarmed. "Probably just a deer," I suggested. "It wasn't a deer," Michael insisted. "It was moving exactly in rhythm with me. When I walked, it walked. When I stopped, it would take a few more steps and then stop too." Now he had my full attention. "What do you mean in rhythm?" "I mean it was matching my pace exactly, step for step, but its steps were bigger, heavier." He ran his hand through his hair, clearly struggling to explain. "Look, I know how this sounds, but something was following me through those trees, and it was deliberately staying hidden." "Did you see anything?" Amanda asked. "No. It was already getting pretty dark, and whatever it was, it stayed just far enough into the trees that I couldn't make it out, but I could hear it clearly, snapping branches rustling through the underbrush. And it was big, much bigger than a deer or a dog." "Bear, maybe," suggested one of our friends. Michael considered this. "Maybe. But bears usually make more noise, right? And they don't typically follow humans like that. This felt deliberate. Like it was interested in me specifically, like it was studying me." We all fell silent for a moment, considering this. I didn't know what to think. Michael wasn't the type to make up stories or exaggerate. He was actually one of the most level-headed people I knew. "Did you tell the adults?" I finally asked. He shrugged. "I mentioned something to your dad, but he just said it was probably wildlife and not to worry about it. And maybe he's right. It didn't feel like normal wildlife behavior." We eventually decided it must have been some kind of animal, maybe curious but cautious about human presence. We agreed to stay alert, but tried not to dwell on it. After all, we were in wild country, and encounters with wildlife were to be expected. Still, I noticed that Michael positioned his tent so that he was surrounded by other tents, not on the perimeter of our camp. The night passed without incident. I slept surprisingly well on my air mattress, despite the earlier conversation. The next day was filled with hiking, exploring tide pools along the coast, and typical camping activities. By evening, Michael seemed to have relaxed considerably, and the previous night's experience was largely forgotten, or at least pushed aside. It wasn't until the third day, as we were preparing to leave, that something happened that brought Michael's experience rushing back. We were breaking down camp, packing gear, and cleaning up the site. Amanda volunteered to make the first trip back to the cars with some of the lighter items. She grabbed a few backpacks and started down the trail alone. None of us thought anything of it. It was broad daylight, and the trail was simple enough. About 45 minutes later, Amanda came back up the trail for a second load. Her face had that same pale, unsettled look that Michael's had worn 2 nights before. When she reached camp, she came straight to me. "Catherine, remember what Michael said about something following him on the trail?" Her voice was shaking slightly. My stomach dropped. "Yes. Why?" "The same thing happened to me, just now, on my way down to the cars." I called Michael over, and Amanda explained what had happened. As she walked down the trail alone, she began to hear movement in the forest parallel to her path. At first, she thought it was just the wind or small animals, but then she realized the sounds were synchronized with her own movements. When she walked, it walked. When she paused, it would continue briefly before also stopping. "It was staying just out of sight, in the trees to my right," she said, pointing back toward the trail. "But it was keeping pace with me the whole way." "Did you see anything?" Michael asked urgently. Amanda shook her head. "No, but I could tell it was big. The footsteps were heavy. I could feel slight vibrations in the ground, and it was covering ground quickly, like taking one stride for every 2 or 3 of mine." Michael nodded vigorously. "That's exactly what I experienced. The stride length seemed too long to be a person." By this point, some of the adults had noticed our huddle and came over to see what was going on. Amanda reluctantly explained her experience, but just like with Michael, they were dismissive, in a kind way, but dismissive nonetheless. "Probably just an elk or a deer," my dad suggested. "They're curious animals." "Or maybe a bear checking you out," added my uncle. "Best to make noise when you're hiking alone." But I could tell from the looks Amanda and Michael exchanged that neither of them believed these explanations, and honestly neither did I. The coincidence was too striking. 2 people experiencing the exact same thing on the same stretch of trail, days apart. As we packed up the last of our gear, my aunt approached us with her phone. No service out here, of course, but I was reading about this area before we left. Supposedly, there have been a lot of strange sightings in these woods over the years. "What kind of sightings?" I asked, already suspecting what she might say. "Oh, you know, the usual camping boogeyman stories," she said with a light laugh. "Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. This whole Olympic Peninsula area is apparently a hot spot. Under normal circumstances, we might have laughed this off. None of us had ever taken Bigfoot stories seriously. But after what Michael and Amanda had experienced, the suggestion landed differently." The stories say they're curious about humans but shy away from direct contact, my aunt continued, clearly finding the topic entertaining rather than disturbing. They supposedly will observe from a distance, sometimes follow hikers from just inside the tree line. Some researchers think they're just trying to ensure humans aren't a threat to their territory. I watched Michael and Amanda exchange glances again. Neither said anything, but I could tell they were both thinking the same thing I was. What if? When it was time to leave, we decided that no one would walk the trail alone. We paired up, carrying our remaining gear down to the cars. Michael, Amanda, and I formed one group, and we found ourselves constantly scanning the trees beside the path. I don't know what we expected to see. A shadowy figure, movement in the underbrush, maybe even the classic silhouette from that famous film footage. But there was nothing. Whatever had tracked my cousin and sister earlier seemed to have disappeared. Or maybe it was still there, watching, but chose not to reveal itself to a larger group. The drive home was unusually quiet. Normally, after a camping trip, we'd be chatting about our favorite moments, already planning the next adventure. But this time, there was an undercurrent of unease. When we reached cell service again, Michael immediately started researching Sasquatch sightings in the Olympic Peninsula. There were dozens of reported encounters, many describing experiences remarkably similar to what he and Amanda had gone through. Unseen creatures paralleling hikers through the forest, matching their pace while remaining hidden. I've spent a lot of time in the years since trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it really was just wildlife, a curious deer or elk. Maybe the isolation of the forest played tricks on their senses, making normal sounds seem coordinated and intelligent. Maybe it was even another hiker or camper, though that wouldn't explain the heavy footfalls or the long stride length. But deep down, I believe my cousin and sister encountered something unusual in those woods. Something intelligent enough to understand it was being observed when it made noise, smart enough to adjust its pace to match theirs, deliberate enough to remain just out of sight. I've gone camping many times since then, in various forests across the country. But I've never returned to that particular area of the Olympic Peninsula. Neither have Michael or Amanda. Whatever was in those woods, whether it was a known animal, an undiscovered species, or something that exists in the shadowy realm between myth and reality, it left a mark on us. To this day, whenever I'm in a dense forest and the sounds around me suddenly go quiet, I find myself listening for those matching footsteps just beyond the trees. And I wonder, is it just my imagination, or is something watching me, studying me, deciding whether to reveal itself or remain forever, a mystery in the shadows? That's my story. I don't have proof. I don't have photos or recordings or physical evidence of any kind. Just the unsettling experiences of two people I trust completely, and the lingering feeling that the forests of the Pacific Northwest might harbor secrets we're not yet meant to understand. Story 3. I've never really talked about this before. Even typing it now, my hands are shaking a little. But after seeing others share similar experiences, I think it's time I tell someone about what happened to me growing up. People might think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw and experienced was real. My name is Nathan. In the summer of '81, when I was just 5 years old, my family moved to this huge property in the Williper Hills in southwest Washington. We're talking 64 acres of pure wilderness, dense forest, caves, animal trails everywhere, and these beautiful winding streams. For a kid, it was paradise. I spent most of my childhood exploring those woods with the neighborhood kids and my friend's cousin who visited on weekends and during summer breaks. But we weren't always alone out there. I still remember the first time I saw him. We were maybe half a mile into the forest, farther than we'd ever gone before. I was with my friend Tommy and his cousin Becky. We were following this deer trail that wound alongside a creek when I got this weird feeling, like when someone's staring at you. I turned around and nearly pissed myself. There, partially hidden behind a massive cedar tree, was something. At first, I thought it was another kid, but something was off. It was shorter than us, maybe about 4 feet tall, but built differently. Stockier, more muscular, especially in the shoulders and chest, and it was covered in hair. Not like a beard or something, but all over. Dark brown, almost black in some places. Tommy saw it too and grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. We all froze. The creature didn't move either, just watched us with these intelligent eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were aware, conscious. I can still see them perfectly, dark and deeply set, but unmistakably intelligent. After what felt like forever, it made this soft huffing sound and took a step forward. I remember its feet were massive compared to its body, and its arms hung lower than a person should. Becky started crying quietly, but I wasn't scared anymore, just fascinated. It never came closer than about 20 feet that first day, just followed us for about an hour as we continued exploring, keeping its distance, but clearly curious. When we turned back toward home, it stopped following at this certain point, like there was an invisible boundary it wouldn't cross. We didn't tell our parents. Somehow, we all understood that adults wouldn't get it or would ruin everything. Kids have that instinct sometimes. The creature, we started calling him Forest Friend at first, then just F for short, showed up again the next weekend, and the weekend after that. By the end of that summer, he was a regular part of our adventures, always appearing when we reached the deeper parts of the forest, never following us home, never showing himself when adults were around. Communication was tricky at first. F didn't speak English or anything recognizable as language, but he was clearly trying to communicate. He'd use hand gestures, pointing at things, making expressions that were surprisingly human despite his appearance. Over time, we developed this weird mix of hand signals, drawings in dirt, and what I now recognize was a kind of improvised sign language. I remember this one time when Tommy got lost. We'd been playing hide and seek and he wandered off too far. After searching for almost an hour, I was on the verge of breaking our pact and going to get my dad. That's when F appeared beside me, tugging gently at my sleeve. He made this low whistling sound, then motioned for me to follow. He moved differently than we did through the forest, almost gliding between trees, never breaking branches or making noise. He led me about a quarter-mile to a small ravine where Tommy had fallen and twisted his ankle. F had found him and had placed some kind of leafy poultice on the injury. Tommy later said F had been sitting with him for a while, keeping him company until help arrived. The poultice actually helped. The swelling went down enough for Tommy to walk home, and his parents just assumed he'd put some mud on it himself. That was the first time we realized F wasn't just some weird forest kid. He knew things, especially about plants. As the months passed, we noticed F wasn't always alone. Sometimes, when we'd bring food to share, would occasionally make mistakes that led to being spotted. They weren't a monolith. They were individuals with different personalities and behaviors. F was curious and relatively trusting. Others remained permanently shy and distant. I still live in the area, though not on the original property. Sometimes, when I'm hiking in the deeper parts of the forest, I'll find small arrangements of objects that don't occur naturally. A feather stuck upright in a neat circle of pebbles, or certain berries laid out in a pattern, messages perhaps, or just their way of creating. Researchers have contacted me a few times asking to visit the area. I've always declined. These beings have successfully remained hidden from mainstream discovery for good reason, and I feel they deserve their privacy. What we had was special, a cross-species friendship that developed organically through childhood curiosity and openness. There are more of them out there than people realize. They're watching, learning, and adapting, and sometimes, if you're lucky and they sense no threat, they might just decide to make contact. But don't go looking for them with cameras and equipment. That's not how it works. I often wonder about F. Is he still out there? Does he remember the human children he used to play with? Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I'll make our old signal. 3 short whistles followed by a specific hand gesture. So far, there's been no response, but I keep trying. Those weren't just childhood fantasies or misidentifications. They were real interactions with a species that has chosen to remain hidden alongside us. And in a way, they helped raise me, taught me about respect for nature, communication beyond words, and the value of keeping some mysteries sacred. I don't expect everyone to believe me, that's fine, but I know what I experienced. And somewhere in those dense forests of the Williper Hills, they know too. Story 4. I'm still not the same person I was before that day. It's been over 45 years now, but I can still smell that musky odor when I close my eyes at night. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling watched. Maybe writing this down will help, but honestly, I doubt it. Some things just stay with you forever. It happened in September of 1975. I was 23 then, living in this small town in Alberta, not far from the Peace River. My friend Olivia and I had decided to visit this old cemetery near where the Peace and Smoky Rivers meet. It sounds morbid now, but back then we were into local history, and that cemetery had graves dating back to the early settlers. The day started normally enough. It was one of those perfect early fall days, not too hot, not too cold, with this golden light filtering through the trees that were just starting to change color. Olivia picked me up in her old Chevy Nova around 10 in the morning. We packed some sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, and our cameras. We were planning to take photos of some of the older headstones for a local historical project we were working on. The drive out there took about 45 minutes on these winding back roads. The cemetery itself was pretty isolated. No houses nearby, just surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides, and a view of the river confluence on the 4th. When we got there, the place was completely deserted, which wasn't surprising. Not many people visited except on anniversaries or special occasions. We spent a couple hours wandering among the graves, taking pictures and making notes about the dates and inscriptions. I remember feeling peaceful there, which seems ironic now. Around 1 in the afternoon, we decided to take a lunch break. We sat on this fallen log near the edge of the cemetery, eating our sandwiches and looking out at the rivers coming together below. It was so quiet you could hear the water flowing if you listened hard enough. After lunch, we went back to work. By around 3 o'clock, I started feeling the coffee I'd been drinking all day. There wasn't any proper bathroom, of course, but there was this little pyramid-shaped outbuilding at the far edge of the cemetery that served as a primitive toilet. It was basically just a wooden structure over a pit. Not exactly luxury accommodations, but it would do the job. I told Olivia I needed to use the washroom and would be back in a few minutes. She said she was getting tired and would go warm up the car while I was gone. I remember watching her walk away, heading back down the narrow path toward the parking area, her red sweater bright against the dark green of the pines. That's the last normal moment I can recall from that day. As I approached the toilet structure, something felt wrong. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that, but worse. I slowed down, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The washroom was about 30 yards from the main cemetery area, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. I could no longer see Olivia or the parking lot. I was maybe 10 feet from the toilet when I noticed movement beside it, just a shadow shifting slightly. At first, I thought it might be a deer, or maybe even a bear. We'd had bear warnings that summer, so I stopped and listened, ready to back away slowly like they teach you. That's when I heard it. This heavy, wet exhalation, like someone breathing through a congested nose, but louder, deeper. And with that breath came the smell. God, that smell. It was like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something musky I can't even describe. It hit me so hard I actually gagged. Then I saw it. Standing beside the toilet structure was something, not a bear, not any animal I'd ever seen before. It was tall, so tall. I'm 5'6", and this thing towered over me, 7 feet at least, maybe more. Its outline was obscured by the shadows of the trees, but I could see enough to know this was no normal forest animal. My bladder suddenly didn't matter anymore. Pure instinct took over, and I started backing away, trying not to make any sudden movements. I turned and began walking quickly, not running yet, but moving with purpose, back toward the main cemetery area. Every step felt like I was moving through molasses. I'd made it maybe 20 yards when I heard Olivia shout from the direction of the car, "Emma, hurry up!" There was urgency in her voice that made my blood run cold. Could she see something I couldn't? I turned to look over my shoulder, and that's when true terror hit me. The thing wasn't beside the toilet anymore. It was behind me, following me, 4 feet away at most. It was moving in the strangest way, almost crouched with its front limbs, arms touching the ground and its rear higher in the air. And it was sniffing the air, sniffing at me. In that moment, I got my first clear look at it. The creature had this coarse, dark, blondish hair like a horse's winter coat, but stiffer, shaggier. The hair wasn't uniformly covering its body. It was patchy in places, thicker on the limbs, sparse on what I guess was its torso. Its face was the most disturbing part, almost ape-like, but wrong somehow, with less hair except for the top of its head. Its eyes were deep-set and dark, watching me with an intelligence that seemed impossible. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second I was frozen in place. The next I was sprinting across the cemetery, dodging between headstones, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I could hear it behind me, not running exactly, but moving, following, this rhythmic sound of heavy steps crushing the fallen leaves. Olivia was in the car, engine already running, driver's door open. She was screaming for me to hurry. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, my legs pumping, fueled by pure adrenaline. I reached the car and practically dove inside, slamming the door behind me. "Go!" I screamed, and Olivia didn't ask questions. She threw the car into reverse, backing up so fast we fishtailed on the gravel, then spun the wheel and shifted into drive. As we pulled away, something made me look back through the rear window. What I saw will haunt me until I die. The creature had stopped at the edge of the tree line and was now standing fully upright, not on all fours anymore, but standing tall like a human. It raised its impossibly long arms and let out a sound I can only describe as a scream of rage. It wasn't an animal sound, not a bear's roar or a cougar's screech. It was something primal and terrifying that seemed to vibrate through my body. Then, most horrifying of all, it started to chase us. Not like a bear would chase. This thing ran upright on 2 legs, its arms swinging by its sides. Olivia floored it, and the Chevy's tires spun on the gravel before catching traction. We fishtailed around the corner and down the hill that led away from the cemetery. I turned around in my seat to look out the back window again, expecting to see nothing, hoping to see nothing. But it was there, following us down the hillside, moving with impossible speed for something so large. It was only when we hit the paved road and Olivia pushed the speedometer past 60 that we finally left it behind. For the first minute of our escape, neither of us spoke. The only sound was our panicked breathing and the roar of the engine as Olivia kept her foot heavy on the gas pedal. Finally, when we were several miles away, she looked at me with wide, shocked eyes. "What the fuck was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. I was trembling so hard my teeth were chattering, even though it wasn't cold. My mind was trying to make sense of what we'd seen, trying to fit it into some category I understood. A bear? A moose? Some kind of deformed person? Nothing made sense. "Did you see it?" I finally managed to ask. "By the car?" Olivia nodded, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I was in the car waiting, and I looked up at the rearview mirror and saw something big moving behind you. At first I thought it was a bear, but then, Emma, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I've ever seen before. We drove straight back to town, neither of us suggesting we stop anywhere. I don't think either of us would have been able to get out of that car until we were somewhere safe with other people around. The whole way back, I kept checking the side mirrors, half expecting to see that thing loping along the roadside after us. When Olivia dropped me off at my parents' house, I was still living at home then. I was in such a state that my mother took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I broke down crying and told her everything. To her credit, she didn't dismiss it or tell me I was imagining things. She called my uncle, who worked for the forestry service, and he promised to go out to the cemetery the next day with a couple of other guys to check things out. They went, but all they found was some tufts of coarse hair caught on a low branch near the toilet structure. No footprints, the ground was too dry and covered with pine needles. No creature. My uncle brought the hair back, but no one knew what to do with it. This was 1975. Not like now, where you could just send something off for DNA testing. The hair eventually got lost or thrown away. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I refused to go anywhere near the woods alone. Olivia and I talked about it constantly at first, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We even went to the library and looked through books on North American wildlife, but nothing matched what we'd encountered. Then, in December of that same year, there was a report in the local paper about some unusual large footprints found near the power lines just outside of town. The article speculated about a large bear, but I knew better. I cut that article out and still have it somewhere in a box in my attic. Over time, Olivia and I stopped talking about it as much. What was there to say? No one else had seen what we saw. People in town started giving us strange looks if we brought it up. Eventually, Olivia moved away to Edmonton for work, and we lost touch. I sometimes wonder if she still thinks about that day as much as I do. I stayed in that town for another 5 years before moving away myself. In all that time, I never went back to that cemetery, and I never heard of anyone else having a similar experience in the area. But I also never went into the woods alone again. I'm 69 years old now, and I've told this story maybe a handful of times in my life. Most people react with polite skepticism. A few have suggested it was a bear walking on its hind legs, or even a person in some kind of costume, though why anyone would be out there alone in a monster costume is beyond me. I know what I saw. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal. The way it moved, first on all fours and then upright. The intelligence in its eyes, that horrible scream that sounded almost angry, like we had invaded its territory and it wanted us to know. These days, when I hear stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings, I don't laugh like most people do. I don't share my story either. What's the point? But I know in my heart that there are things in the wilderness that we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what exists and what doesn't. Sometimes at night, especially when I'm staying somewhere near forests or mountains, I still wake up in a cold sweat, that musky smell somehow fresh in my nostrils again, as if no time has passed at all. And I lie there in the dark, listening, wondering if somewhere out there, that creature is still roaming the forests of northern Alberta, watching and waiting for someone else to wander too far from safety. Story 5. I still can't believe what happened to me and my wife Rebecca back in February of '77. It's been so many years, but I swear I still hear that sound in my dreams sometimes. We were living on my dad's farm, northwest of Drayton Valley in Alberta at the time. Beautiful place, really, about a mile west on the highway towards Cynthia, then another 1.5 miles north down this side road. Pretty isolated, surrounded by thick forest, pine, spruce, poplar, you name it. The yard itself was cleared, but beyond that it was all wilderness. It was a freezing cold night, must have been around 1 a.m. Rebecca and I were just getting ready for bed. I remember I was brushing my teeth when we heard it. This sound that came from outside. Not an animal sound I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a cougar, nothing like that. Rebecca froze. I saw her face go completely white. "What the hell was that?" I asked. but she just shook her head. I could tell she was scared, which wasn't like her at all. Rebecca grew up in rural Alberta too, so she wasn't the type to get spooked by normal wildlife sounds. "That's not human," she whispered, and something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I went to the front door and opened it, peering out into the darkness. The yard light wasn't working that night, just my luck, and there was only moonlight reflecting off the snow. I couldn't see a damn thing beyond the first few yards from our porch. "I'm going to go check it out," I said, reaching for my coat and boots. Rebecca grabbed my arm hard. "Marcus, don't you dare go out there," she hissed. "Whatever made that sound isn't something you want to meet in the dark." Now, I'm not usually one to back down from things, but something in her voice convinced me. We stood at the door for another minute or two, straining to hear anything else, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the creaking of the house. Eventually, we decided to wait until morning to investigate. Neither of us slept much that night, though. Rebecca kept getting up to look out the windows, and I kept thinking I heard heavy footsteps outside, though I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination. When morning finally came, we bundled up and went outside. The temperature was well below freezing, and our breath came out in thick clouds. I remember the snow was deep, maybe 2 feet in most places, and had a crusty layer on top from where it had partially melted and refrozen. We hadn't gone more than 20 yards from the house when Rebecca called me over. She was standing by the west side of the garage, staring at something in the snow. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." I trudged over through the snow and saw what had her so worked up. Footprints, but not just any footprints. These were huge, I mean absolutely massive. Later, when we measured them, they turned out to be 18 inches long and 6.5 inches across. They looked just like a human foot with 5 toes and a heel, except they were gigantic, and they were fresh from the night before. "Whatever made that sound was standing right here," Rebecca said, 75 feet from our bedroom. The thought made my stomach turn. Whatever it was had been that close to our house while we were inside, completely unaware until it made that ungodly sound. We decided to follow the tracks. I grabbed a tape measure from the house, and Rebecca got her camera. Though I don't know if the pictures ever turned out. We lost track of them years ago during a move. The tracks led away from the garage, heading northwest toward a cut line that went into the swamp beyond our property. The thing that struck me most about the tracks was how deep they were. Whatever made them was heavy, way heavier than a person. And the stride length was incredible, easily twice what a tall man could manage, especially in deep snow. As we followed the tracks into the swamp, the going got tougher. The swamp was covered with tangled undergrowth and fallen logs, all buried under snow. But the creature had just barreled through it all, leaving a clear path of massive footprints and broken branches. About half a mile in, Rebecca spotted something unusual on a pine tree. As we got closer, we could see where the creature had apparently leaned against the tree to rest. The bark was smooth in a large patch, as if something had pressed against it. But what really got our attention was the hair. There were these long, coarse hairs stuck to the frozen bark of the tree. They were dark brown, almost black, and unlike any animal hair I'd ever seen. They weren't from a bear or a moose or anything else I could identify. Rebecca carefully picked them off the tree and put them in this little leather pouch she had. She wanted to show them to my dad when he got back from his trip to Edmonton. "This is proof, Marcus," she said, her eyes wide. "This is actual physical proof of what was here." The tracks continued past the tree, still heading northwest. We followed them for another mile or so until they reached a creek that ran through the property. The ice on the creek wasn't thick enough to support a person, but whatever made those tracks had crossed it with no problem, breaking through in places but continuing on the other side. We decided to turn back at that point. It was getting colder, and we'd been out for hours already. On the way back, Rebecca kept looking over her shoulder as if she expected to see something following us. I kept telling her we were fine, that whatever it was had clearly moved on. But I was doing the same thing when she wasn't looking. When we got back to the house, we sat at the kitchen table with cups of hot coffee, trying to make sense of what we'd found. Rebecca was convinced it was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot. I was skeptical at first, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank or something with a more rational explanation. But the more I thought about it, the less sense anything else made. The footprints were too big for a human, the stride too long, and that sound, God, that sound wasn't anything I'd ever heard before or since. I think its scream was a warning, Rebecca said after a while. I don't think it wanted to hurt us. It was just passing through and saw our lights on. Maybe it was startled. That made sense to me. The creature hadn't tried to get into the house or anything like that. It had just been there, outside, and then moved on. If it had wanted to hurt us, it easily could have. We were completely vulnerable. For weeks after that night, I kept the rifle closer to the bed and made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight before going to sleep. Rebecca refused to be alone in the house at night, and I can't say I blamed her. Knowing that thing had been so close, just standing there in the dark while we were inside, unaware, it still makes my skin crawl. We told a few people about what happened. My dad, a couple of close friends, but most of them just laughed it off or thought we were exaggerating. The hair samples disappeared somewhere along the way. Rebecca thinks my dad threw them out, thinking they were just some trash in a pouch. Without those and without the photos, which, like I said, probably didn't turn out anyway, we didn't have much to back up our story. But I know what we saw. Those weren't normal tracks, and that wasn't a normal sound. And over the years, I've heard other stories from people in the area. A logger who saw something massive moving through the trees near Cynthia. A hunter who found similar tracks near a creek bed about 10 miles from our place. A family who heard the same kind of scream while camping and packed up in the middle of the night to leave. I've never seen the creature myself, just its tracks. But Rebecca swears that one night about a month after the initial incident, she saw a large, dark figure standing at the edge of the woods behind our house. She said it was just a silhouette, but it was huge, 7 or 8 feet tall at least, and stood upright like a person. By the time she got me to look, it was gone. We moved away from that farm a year later. My dad sold the place, and we bought a house in Edmonton. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners ever experienced anything similar, if that thing still roams those woods. Part of me wants to go back, to see if I can find any new evidence, but a bigger part of me is content to leave it all in the past, except for that sound. That's the one thing I can't seem to shake, even after all these years. It wasn't just a scream or a howl. It was something in between, something that seemed to resonate in your chest and make your hair stand on end. Rebecca described it best when she said it sounded ancient, like something that shouldn't exist in our modern world, but somehow still does. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a weird atmospheric phenomenon, or some combination of animal sounds distorted by the cold air and the acoustics of the forest. Maybe those tracks were made by someone with homemade snowshoes playing a prank. Maybe the hair we found was just from some unusual bear with a skin condition. But deep down, I know better. Whatever was outside our house that February night wasn't something that science has a neat little category for. It was something else, something that most people go their whole lives without encountering. And honestly, I consider myself lucky to have only heard it and seen its tracks, not the thing itself. Rebecca feels differently. She says that night changed her forever, made her realize how little we actually know about the world around us. She spent years researching similar encounters, connecting with other people who've had experiences like ours. She says it's more common than people think, especially in the remote areas of Canada and the northern United States. As for me, I've tried to put it behind me, to focus on normal life, but every once in a while, usually when I'm camping or hiking somewhere remote, I'll hear a twig snap or catch a whiff of something musky and unfamiliar on the breeze, and I'll remember those massive tracks in the snow and that unearthly sound that cut through the quiet night. And I'll wonder if it's still out there, moving through the wilderness, occasionally crossing paths with humans who, like us, are forever changed by the encounter. I don't have answers, even after all these years. Just the memory of those tracks in the snow, those strange hairs on the tree, and that sound, that terrible, fascinating sound that I hope to never hear again, but that I know I'll never forget. Story 6. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my immediate family and close friends. Even now, 40-something years later, I get this weird feeling in my stomach when I think about it. I've read other people's stories on here, and I finally feel like maybe someone might believe me. This happened back in July of 1979, when I was 14. My mum's family had this old homestead near North Buck Lake in Alberta, close to Boyle. It wasn't anything fancy, just this weathered farmhouse with a big yard, some outbuildings, and a lot of surrounding wilderness. Every summer, we'd go up there for a couple weeks. My mom called it getting back to our roots, but for me it was mostly about fishing and exploring with my cousin Caleb. That particular day started normal enough. It was hot, one of those bright Alberta summer days where the sun feels like it's never going to set. Me, Caleb, my Uncle Dave, and a couple of my mom's friends had gone fishing at this spot everyone called the Narrows. It's where two big sections of the lake connect through this skinny channel. The fishing was decent that day. I remember catching a few pike, and Caleb got this massive walleye that he wouldn't shut up about. By late afternoon, the adults were still drinking beers and telling the same old stories they always did. Caleb and I got bored. He had this beat-up Yamaha dirt bike that he'd brought up on his dad's truck, and he suggested we head back to the farm early. I was all for it. We had video games planned for the evening and wanted to get a head start before the adults came back and hogged the TV. The ride from the Narrows back to the farm was probably about 7 or 8 miles, mostly dirt roads cutting through dense forest and past a few scattered farms. I climbed on the back of Caleb's bike and we took off. The roads weren't great, all rutted dirt with these random washboard sections that rattled your teeth. But it was fun going fast, feeling the wind and the excitement of being on our own. We'd gone maybe 2/3 of the way back, and I remember exactly where we were, right after this long, straight stretch where the road eventually makes a hard right turn to head toward the farm. I was just looking ahead, not really thinking about anything, when I spotted what looked like someone walking along the road maybe a mile ahead of us. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't that weird to see people walking on these back roads. Maybe someone's car broke down or a neighbor was just out for a walk. But as we got closer, something started to feel off. The figure was way bigger than a normal person should be, and darker somehow, even though it was still daylight. I wanted to say something to Caleb, but the bike was so loud there was no way he'd hear me. So I just kept watching as we got closer and closer. Now we were maybe a 1/4 mile away, and I could see it better. It was walking upright, like a human, but something about the way it moved was wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down almost to the knees, and it was just massive, like football linebacker massive, but taller, way taller. I remember feeling this growing knot in my stomach. My heart started racing, and I got this cold sweat even though it was still hot out. I kept thinking maybe it was just some big guy out for a walk, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No human moves like that or looks that big against the landscape. Then the strangest thing happened. We came to that part of the road where you need to make a hard right to get to the farm. After another long, straight stretch, Caleb suddenly slammed on the brakes. He didn't say anything, just stopped the bike dead in the middle of the road. The engine was still running, but we weren't moving. "Did you see that?" I asked him, practically yelling over the engine. Caleb nodded, his face pale. Yeah, what was it? The thing was maybe 50 yards ahead of us now. When we stopped, it stopped too. It was like it suddenly realized we were watching it. For a second, just one horrible second, it turned slightly in our direction. I'll never forget what happened next. It sort of crouched down, almost like it was trying to make itself smaller, and then, in one fluid motion that no human could ever make, it darted off the road into the ditch and disappeared into the bushes. It didn't run like a person, it was more like... I don't know how to describe it. Almost like the way a bear might run if it stood upright, but faster and smoother. 1 second it was there on the road, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the trees and underbrush. I felt Caleb's whole body tense up. Without a word, he cranked the throttle, and the bike lurched forward so fast I almost fell off. I had to grab his waist to stay on as he sped toward the farm. He was going way faster than was safe on those roads, and I remember thinking we might crash. But in that moment, crashing seemed less scary than whatever the hell we'd just seen. We got back to the farm in record time. Caleb parked the bike right by the back door, instead of in the shed where he usually kept it. We both jumped off, and I noticed his hands were shaking. Mine were too. "What do we do?" I asked him. The adults wouldn't be back for hours. "Fire," was all Caleb said. "Let's build a big fire." It sounds weird now, but it made perfect sense then. It was still daylight, but we started gathering wood like our lives depended on it. We built this massive bonfire in the fire pit in the yard, way bigger than we'd normally make. Once it was going good, Caleb disappeared into the house and came back with his dad's .22 rifle and my uncle's old .22 pistol. "Here," he said, handing me the pistol. "Do you remember how to use it?" I did. Uncle Dave had taught me the summer before, but a .22 seemed pathetically small against whatever we'd seen on the road. Still, it was better than nothing. The weird thing is, we didn't really talk about what we'd seen, not directly. We just kind of made this unspoken agreement to stay close to the house, keep the fire going and keep the guns nearby. Deep down, I think we both knew what it was, but saying it out loud seemed like it would make it more real somehow. I remember sitting there by the fire, watching the tree line at the edge of the property as the sun started to go down. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. Caleb kept loading and unloading the rifle, checking the action over and over. "You ever hear those stories?" he finally asked, still staring at the trees. I knew exactly what he meant. Growing up in that area, you heard things. The local farmers sometimes talked about strange occurrences, missing livestock, weird tracks in the mud that were too big to be a bear, strange howls at night that didn't sound like any wolf or coyote. "Yeah," I said. "My grandpa used to talk about something living in the woods around the lake." Caleb nodded. "Dad says it's bullshit. Says it's just bears people are seeing." "That wasn't a bear," I said quietly. "No," Caleb agreed. "It wasn't." The adults came back right around sunset. They were in good spirits, laughing and carrying their fishing gear and coolers. Uncle Dave took one look at our bonfire and the guns and frowned. "What the hell are you boys doing with those?" he demanded, nodding at the rifles. Caleb and I exchanged glances. We hadn't discussed what to tell them. "We saw something on the road coming back," Caleb finally said. "Something like what?" Uncle Dave asked, his tone softening a bit. "We don't know," I jumped in. "It was big, walking on 2 legs, but not a person." The adults exchanged looks. My mom came over and put her hand on my shoulder. "Honey, it was probably just a bear," she said. "They stand up sometimes." "No, Mom, it wasn't a bear. It was walking. For like a full minute. We watched it. Uncle Dave took the guns from us and unloaded them. Well, whatever it was, it's not coming here. You boys are letting your imaginations run wild." But I noticed he put the rifles just inside the back door instead of locking them up right away. And nobody suggested putting out the bonfire, even though it was way bigger than usual. Dinner that night was weird. The adults tried to act normal, but I caught them glancing out the windows more than usual. After we ate, instead of spreading out around the house like we normally would, everyone stayed in the main room. Uncle Dave turned on the TV, but nobody seemed to be watching it. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen, the way it moved, so fluid but so wrong at the same time, the size of it against the landscape, the way it crouched and then just disappeared into the brush like something that knew the woods better than any human could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was sharing a room with Caleb, and I could tell by his breathing that he was awake too. "Caleb," I whispered. "Yeah? Do you think it followed us?" There was a long pause. "I don't know," he finally said. "Maybe." "What do you think it was?" I asked, even though we both knew. "Sasquatch," he said, barely audible. "Had to be." Just hearing him say it sent a chill down my spine. Growing up in rural Alberta, you heard the stories. First Nations people had their legends, and the old-time trappers and hunters had their encounters, but it was always something that happened to someone else, or a friend of a friend. Never something you saw with your own eyes. Why would it be out, walking on the road? I wondered aloud. Maybe it was crossing from one part of the forest to another, Caleb suggested. Or maybe it was looking for something. We both fell silent after that. The next morning, Uncle Dave and Caleb's dad, my Uncle Mark, asked us to show them exactly where we'd seen the bear. We took them out on the four-wheeler, but when we got to the spot, there was nothing to see. No tracks in the hard-packed dirt of the road, no broken branches where it had disappeared into the bush. "See, boys," Uncle Mark said, "nothing to worry about." But I noticed the way he scanned the tree line, how his hand kept drifting to the rifle he'd brought along. Later that day, when the adults thought we weren't listening, I overheard Uncle Dave and my mum talking in low voices in the kitchen. "The Andersons over on Concession Road said they lost 3 sheep last week," Uncle Dave was saying. "No blood, no struggle, just gone. And Bill found some tracks by his pond that he couldn't identify." "Dave, don't," my mum said. "Don't encourage this. The boys are already spooked enough." "I'm not saying it's that," Uncle Dave replied, "but something's been going on around here. You know the stories as well as I do." The rest of that vacation passed without incident, but things were different. Nobody went anywhere alone. The bonfire was bigger every night. And more than once I caught the adults standing on the porch, staring out into the darkness beyond the yard lights. When we got home, I started looking up everything I could about Sasquatch sightings in Alberta. I found old newspaper clippings from the Athabasca paper about similar sightings near Boyle. Locals reporting something massive moving through the woods, strange tracks found in muddy areas near creeks, hunters describing wood knocks and rock clacking that couldn't be explained. All these years later, I still think about what we saw that day. I've never seen anything like it again, but I've never forgotten it either. Sometimes I'll be driving down a country road and I'll find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that dark figure walking along the edge of the forest. The thing is, I've watched all those TV shows about Bigfoot. I've read the books and the articles, but none of them quite capture what it's like to actually see one. The absolute wrongness of it, the way your brain tries to make it into something familiar, a bear, a person in a coat, but can't quite manage it. I don't talk about it much. Most people don't believe you anyway. They smile and nod and think you're exaggerating or making it up entirely. But Caleb and I know what we saw. And sometimes, when we get together at family functions, we'll exchange a look when someone mentions going camping or hiking in the woods. We never went back to fish at the Narrows again, and neither of us has ever gone walking alone in the woods since that day. Some things you just don't forget. Some things change how you see the world forever. Story 7. I don't talk about this much. Actually, I haven't told anyone outside my family in years. but something about seeing all these similar experiences here makes me think maybe someone will understand or have answers. This happened in August of 1985 when I was 11 years old, and to this day I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I grew up in Morley, Alberta, a small community surrounded by beautiful forests and mountains. Our house sat near the edge of some woods, and that summer my dad had decided we needed more space to play. He knew a guy with a bulldozer who cleared out a nice-sized patch in the trees about 200 yards from our backyard. Nothing fancy, just enough room for us kids to play without constantly losing balls in the underbrush or breaking windows at the house. That particular day was perfect, warm but not too hot, with that golden late summer sunshine that makes everything look like it's glowing. School was starting in just a couple weeks, so we were trying to squeeze every drop out of our freedom. My siblings and I, James, that's me, Michael, who was 9, Sarah, who was 13, and little Emily, who had just turned 7, were playing baseball with our cousin Nathan, who was staying with us for the week. Nathan was 12 and always acted like he knew everything about everything. We'd been out there for hours. Mom had called us in for lunch around noon, but we wolfed it down and ran straight back out. The clearing was our favorite place that summer. No adults telling us what to do, just us and the game. By early evening, the shadows from the trees were starting to stretch across our makeshift field, but we weren't ready to quit yet. It was Nathan's turn at bat, and I remember he was being really annoying about my pitching. Too high, too low. Are you even trying, James? I was getting frustrated and had just told him to shut up and swing when it happened. The scream. I've spent over 35 years trying to figure out how to describe that sound, and I still can't do it justice. It started like a siren, this high-pitched wail that seemed to cut through everything. But then it changed. It dropped into this deep, rumbling growl that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. At least, not any animal I'd ever heard before or since. It was like something primeval, something that shouldn't exist in our world. We all froze, completely froze. The bat slipped from Nathan's hands and hit the ground with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that followed the scream. Michael had been on second base, and Sarah was in the outfield. Emily had been sitting cross-legged near what we called first base, actually just an old frisbee. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I remember looking at Sarah, who was the oldest and usually took charge when anything happened. Her face had gone completely white. Her mouth was open like she wanted to say something, but couldn't remember how to form words. Then it happened again. The same sound, that siren wail that morphed into a growl, but closer this time, much closer, and longer. The first one had lasted maybe 5 seconds. This one went on for what felt like forever, but was probably about 10 seconds. That broke the spell. "Run!" Sarah finally shouted, and none of us needed to be told twice. We all took off toward the house, abandoning everything, the bat, our gloves, the ball. Emily was the smallest and slowest, so I grabbed her hand as we ran. I remember her little fingers squeezing mine so tight it almost hurt. We were maybe halfway across the clearing when the third scream came. This one was definitely closer than the last. Like whatever was making that sound was moving fast, coming toward us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode in my chest. The terror was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was this deep, instinctive understanding that whatever was making that sound was dangerous beyond anything we could imagine. The edge of the woods where the screams were coming from was still thick with trees and underbrush. As we ran, I kept my eyes fixed on that tree line, certain I was about to see whatever monster was hunting us burst through the foliage. The worst part was, I couldn't even imagine what it might look like. The sound was so alien, so wrong, that my mind couldn't match it to any creature I knew. Nathan was ahead of us. He'd always been the fastest. Michael was crying as he ran, these gasping sobs that made it sound like he couldn't get enough air. Sarah had reached back and grabbed Emily's other hand, so we were both pulling her along between us. Another scream, the fourth one, came just as we reached the edge of the clearing. This time I swear I could hear something else beneath the scream, something like heavy footsteps or branches breaking, the sound of something big moving through the forest coming our way. The path back to the house went through a narrow stretch of trees, not the dense forest where the sounds were coming from, but a small copse that separated our clearing from the backyard. I remember thinking we were trapped. Whatever was making those sounds could easily cut us off if it moved through those trees, but we didn't have a choice. We plunged into that small stretch of woods, branches whipping at our faces and arms as we ran. Emily stumbled once, and Sarah and I practically lifted her between us, her feet barely touching the ground as we kept moving. That short stretch of trees, maybe 30 yards total, felt like miles. Another scream came when we were in the middle of it, and this one was so loud, so close, that I felt like my eardrums might burst. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the creature was all around us. Michael had reached the edge of our yard by then, and he was screaming for our parents. "Dad, Mom, help!" His voice sounded tiny and pathetic compared to the monstrous sounds from the forest. We burst out of the trees into our backyard, still running full tilt. I remember seeing my dad step onto the back porch, looking confused by all the commotion. Mom was right behind him, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Inside! Get inside!" Sarah was shouting, and I don't think I've ever been so grateful to see our back door in my life. We all tumbled into the kitchen, gasping and crying. Dad quickly shut and locked the door behind us, looking alarmed. "What on earth is going on?" Mom asked, kneeling down to check on Emily, who was full-on sobbing by then. We all tried to talk at once, our words tumbling over each other. A monster! This screaming! It was coming after us. Dad raised his hands to quiet us down, one at a time. "James, you're the oldest boy. What happened?" I was still trying to catch my breath, my heart hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my temple. "There was something in the woods," I managed to say. "It made this sound, this scream, not like anything I've ever heard before." "Like a siren," Michael added, his voice shaking, but then it turned into a growl. Dad looked skeptical, but Sarah nodded emphatically. "It wasn't an animal, Dad, at least not a normal one, and it was coming toward us. We could hear it moving through the trees." Mom looked worried and pulled Emily closer to her. "Did you see anything?" We all shook our heads. "Just heard it," Nathan said. His face was still pale, and I remember thinking I'd never seen my normally boastful cousin look so shaken. But it was big. Whatever it was really big. Dad went to the window that faced the woods and peered out. The sun was starting to set now, casting long shadows across our yard. "I don't see anything," he said after a moment. "Can you hear it?" Sarah asked. We all went quiet, listening. There was nothing now, no screams, no sounds of movement in the woods, just the normal early evening sounds of birds and the distant barking of someone's dog. "It stopped when we got to the house," I said. Dad looked thoughtful. "Well, whatever it was, you're safe now. Probably just a bear or something that got spooked." None of us believed that. Not for a second. Bears don't make sounds like what we heard, but we didn't argue. Later that night, after dinner, I overheard Dad talking to Uncle Robert, Nathan's dad, on the phone. Dad's voice was low, but I could hear enough to know he was asking if Robert had ever heard strange sounds in the woods around Morley. The next morning at breakfast, Dad announced that he and a couple of neighbors were going to check out the clearing and the surrounding woods. They didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of a large animal passing through. Our baseball stuff was still scattered where we'd left it untouched, but something had changed. None of us wanted to play in the clearing anymore. We stayed in the yard for the rest of Nathan's visit, and even after he went home, my siblings and I never ventured back to that spot. Dad seemed to understand, even though he kept insisting it was probably just a mountain lion or something that had wandered down from the higher elevations. Here's the thing though, over the next few weeks, I started paying attention to conversations between adults, at the store, after church, whenever parents would gather and chat. And I realized our experience wasn't unique. There were stories all through Morley, stories people usually told in hushed voices or laughed off as tall tales, stories about strange sounds in the woods, about hunters who felt watched, about massive footprints found near streams. Mr. Jenkins, who ran the hardware store, once mentioned to my dad that he'd heard that weird siren sound while fishing up at Miller's Creek the previous fall. Mrs. Whitefeather, one of the elders in the community, referred to the tall ones who lived deep in the forest and said they'd been there since before people came to the valley. I started collecting these stories, mentally filing them away. Most people would eventually shrug and change the subject, like they were embarrassed to be talking about it. But enough people had experiences that I knew what we heard that day wasn't just our imagination. I'm 38 now, living in Calgary with a family of my own. My siblings have all moved away too. Sarah's in Vancouver, Michael's in Edmonton, and Emily ended up in Toronto. Nathan joined the military and has been stationed all over. We don't talk about that day much, but occasionally when we're all together for Christmas or a family reunion, the conversation will eventually turn to it. "Do you remember that sound?" one of us will ask. And we'll all go quiet, because we do. We all remember it exactly the same way, that siren-like wail that became a growl, the way it paralyzed us with terror. The sense that whatever made it was not just an animal, but something other. I've read books about Bigfoot sightings since then. I've watched documentaries and browsed online forums like this one. Many accounts mention strange vocalizations, but few describe exactly what we heard. But sometimes I'll come across a description that's close enough to send chills down my spine. Someone in Washington State or northern Montana describing a siren-like scream that drops into a growl. I never saw what made that sound, but I don't need to. The sound itself was enough. Whatever it was announced itself to us, warned us away from its territory. And we listened. To this day, I can't hear a distant siren without freezing for just a second, waiting to see if it will drop into that growl. It never does, of course, but part of me is always listening, always waiting. Because once you've heard something like that, something that shouldn't exist in our neat catalogued world of known species, you never really stop listening for it. I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run, or if we'd been just a little slower. Would we have finally seen the creature that made that sound? Sometimes in my dreams, I do see it. A massive, shadowy figure at the edge of the trees, watching us with eyes that somehow reflect no light. But maybe not seeing it was a mercy. The sound alone was enough to change us, to remind us that the world is bigger and stranger than we typically allow ourselves to believe. All I know for certain is that 37 years later, I still won't go hiking alone. I still feel uneasy in dense forests. And when I take my kids camping, I always make sure we're well away from Morley and those particular woods. Because whatever was there in 1985, making that impossible, terrifying sound, I have no reason to believe it isn't still there, watching and waiting in the trees. Story 8. And I still don't know exactly what happened to me back in '87, 36 years later, and I'm still trying to make sense of what I saw out there in Jasper National Park. I've hiked all over North America, but nothing has ever come close to what I experienced during that week on the North Boundary Trail. This wasn't my first rodeo. I'd done plenty of multi-day solo backpacking trips before, and I deliberately chose early June to avoid the crowds. I wanted that pure wilderness experience, you know, just me against nature. I'd spent months planning the route, gathering supplies and training with a full pack. I was beyond prepared, at least for normal hiking hazards. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. absolute solitude in one of the most beautiful wilderness areas in the world. The scenery was breathtaking. Snow-capped mountains, pristine forests, crystal-clear streams. I hadn't seen another human since I'd been dropped off at the trailhead. It was perfect. The isolation was incredible. I'd set up camp each evening, cook my dehydrated meals on my little stove, and just listen to the sounds of the forest as darkness fell. No planes overhead, no distant traffic noise, just pure wilderness. I'd fall asleep to the sound of a nearby stream or the occasional owl hooting in the distance. Snake Indian Pass was challenging, still covered in about 5 feet of snow, but I had my snowshoes and managed to cross without much trouble. Looking back at my tracks afterward, I realized I was probably the first person to cross the pass that season. Something about that gave me a real sense of accomplishment, being the only human for miles and miles around. Wildlife was abundant. I'd seen a few mule deer grazing in meadows, some mountain goats on distant slopes, and plenty of smaller critters. On day 3, I had spotted fresh grizzly tracks and scat, which had me a bit on edge. I carried bear spray and knew the proper protocols, but still, seeing those massive paw prints in the mud is a humbling experience. I took photos of those tracks. I always documented interesting wildlife signs. The weather had been fantastic. Cool mornings warming to comfortable hiking temperatures by midday. On that 6th day, the sun was bright. Birds were chirping, and I remember feeling so alive and connected to the wilderness. I'd been hiking since dawn and had covered a good 15 kilometers already. My plan was to reach an area past Twin Tree Lake, where I'd marked a potential campsite on my map. After passing Twin Tree Lake, the trail began a gentle descent toward a somewhat boggy section. The ground had been fairly dry due to the sunny weather, but this particular stretch was still wet and muddy, typical for early season conditions. I was carefully picking my way through, trying to keep my boots as dry as possible when I spotted them. At first, my brain didn't process what I was seeing. The trail crossed a particularly muddy section, and right there, cutting directly across it, was a line of footprints. Human-looking footprints, but not quite human. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart suddenly pounding. These prints were huge, way bigger than my own size 11 boots, and they were unmistakably fresh. The edges were crisp, the mud still glistening wet in the depressions. Whatever had made these tracks had crossed here very recently. I knelt down to examine them more closely. Each print showed 5 very distinct toes, not like bear paws at all. I could see what looked like skin textures in the mud, dermal ridges, and what appeared to be natural cracks in the skin of the foot. The prints had this distinctive hourglass shape, narrow at the middle, wider at the heel and ball of the foot. They were incredibly detailed impressions. What really got to me was how fresh they were. The ridges between the toes were still damp compared to the wetness of the rest of the impression. There was no debris in the prints, despite the light breeze that was blowing small bits of forest debris across other parts of the trail. I'm no tracking expert, but I'd guess these prints were less than an hour old, maybe even just minutes old. My mouth went dry. I looked up, scanning the forest edge where the tracks disappeared into the thick undergrowth. Whatever made these prints was large, very large, and had walked here very recently. The forest suddenly seemed much darker and more threatening than it had moments before. I actually heard myself say out loud, "Park wardens. Has to be park wardens hiking without boots." Even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Who would be hiking this remote trail barefoot? And whose feet would be that enormous? And why would they walk directly across the muddy section instead of skirting it like any sensible hiker would? I should have taken photos. That's the thing I've kicked myself about for decades now. I had my camera in my pack, but in that moment, all I wanted to do was get moving. Some primal part of my brain was screaming at me to put distance between myself and whatever had made those tracks. I continued down the trail, moving faster than before, constantly looking over my shoulder and scanning the forest around me. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But who would go to such elaborate lengths in such a remote location where they might not see another hiker for days? After about a kilometer or two of fast hiking, the reality of what I'd seen hit me like a truck. Those tracks didn't belong to a human. They weren't bear prints. They weren't any animal I recognized. The only explanation that fit what I'd seen was something I'd never really believed in before that moment: Sasquatch. I'm not some Bigfoot enthusiast. I've always considered myself pretty rational and skeptical. But what else could explain human-like footprints nearly twice the size of my own, with clear toe definition and skin textures, in the absolute middle of nowhere? The realization sent a cold wave of fear through me. I began hiking even faster, almost jogging at times, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that boggy area. My backpack, which had felt manageable all week, now seemed to weigh a ton as adrenaline surged through my system. Every sound in the forest suddenly took on new meaning. Was that just a branch falling, or was something large moving through the trees? Was that just the wind, or was it breathing? I found myself constantly looking behind me, watching the trail edges, scanning the tree line. As the afternoon wore on, I pushed myself harder than I had all week. I blew past my intended campsite, wanting to get as far from those tracks as possible. The rational part of my brain kept trying to talk me down. Even if it was a Sasquatch, there's no history of them attacking people. But the primitive part of my brain wasn't listening to reason. By late afternoon, my legs were burning and my shoulders ached from the pack, but I kept pushing on. The shadows were getting longer, and I knew I'd have to make camp soon. I finally found a small clearing about 5 kilometers beyond my original planned stop. It wasn't ideal, not as close to water as I would have liked, but I was exhausted and didn't want to go any farther. Setting up camp that evening was a surreal experience. Every routine task, pitching my tent, filtering water, cooking dinner, was accompanied by constant vigilance. I kept looking up, scanning the forest edge, listening intently for any sound that seemed out of place. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. Sounds that had been comforting on previous nights, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch, now set my heart racing. I had my hunting knife close at hand as I huddled in my sleeping bag, though I knew it would be useless against anything as large as what had made those tracks. I barely slept that night. Every sound jerked me awake. At one point, around 2 in the morning, I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the forest some distance from my camp. It could have been an elk or a moose, plenty of large animals in Jasper. But in my state of mind, I was convinced it was something else entirely. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, until the sounds faded away. When dawn finally broke, I was already packed and ready to move. I skipped my usual hot breakfast and just scarfed down a protein bar as I hit the trail again. I hiked at a punishing pace that day, constantly looking back over my shoulder. Every time I came to a muddy section, I examined it carefully for tracks. But I never saw anything like what I'd seen the day before. I completed the remaining portion of my planned route in record time, practically jogging the last few kilometers to the pickup point. The ranger who met me there commented that I was 2 days early and asked if something had gone wrong. I mumbled something about the weather turning, not wanting to sound like a lunatic raving about Bigfoot. It wasn't until I got back to civilization that I really processed what had happened. I spent hours in my hotel room that night researching Sasquatch sightings in Jasper National Park. There weren't many official reports, but I found enough stories from other hikers to make me believe I wasn't crazy. 36 years later, and I still think about those tracks almost daily. I've returned to Jasper many times since then, but never alone, and never to that specific section of the North Boundary Trail. I've hiked with groups, with partners, but never solo in deep wilderness again. Something about that experience fundamentally changed my relationship with the wild places I'd always loved. I don't know what made those tracks that day. I can't say with absolute certainty that Sasquatch exists, but I know what I saw: impossibly large, fresh footprints with 5 toes, dermal ridges, and a distinctly non-human stride length, in a place where no human should have been. And whatever it was close enough that if I'd been 15 minutes earlier on the trail, I might have come face to face with it. Sometimes I wish I had. At least then I'd know for sure. Instead, I'm left with this unsettling uncertainty. This knowledge that there might be things in the deep wilderness that we still don't understand. I've never felt fully comfortable in the backcountry since that day. Every time I'm hiking and the trail gets quiet, every time the birds stop singing for no apparent reason, I remember those tracks in the mud and wonder what might be watching me from the trees. I don't know what scared me more: the possibility that Sasquatch might exist, or the thought that something that large could move through the forest so silently that it could have been just feet away from me, and I'd never have known it was there until it was too late. It's been over 3 decades, and I've never told many people this story. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw. Those tracks were real, they were fresh, and whatever made them was close enough that day that I could have rounded a bend in the trail and come face to face with it. That's the thought that still keeps me up at night sometimes. Not what I saw, but what I almost saw. And sometimes, when I'm camping and I hear something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight, I wonder if it's found me again. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for years, but something happened to my family back in August of 1988 that I still can't explain. I've read other accounts on here, and I feel like I need to finally get this off my chest. This happened near Hag Lake in Alberta, Canada, and I swear every word of this is true. I was 22 at the time. My mom, Claudia, my younger brother, Kevin, who was 19, and my 4-year-old son, Dylan, was spending a week camping and fishing while my dad worked nearby. Dad was operating a grader for the fire crews, helping build access roads into some of the more remote areas. It was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation. We'd done the same trip 3 summers in a row. Dad would work during the day, then join us in the evenings. The lake was beautiful, secluded. At least we thought it was. That morning started normally enough. We woke up around 6, had breakfast at our campsite, and headed to the east end of the lake where we'd had good luck catching pike the day before. It was one of those perfect August days. Not too hot, with just enough clouds to keep the sun from beating down on us. Dylan was having a blast, splashing in the shallow water near the shore, while Mom and I baited our hooks. Kevin was about 30 feet away, on a little rocky outcrop that jutted into the lake. We'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours when Kevin called out to us. His voice had this weird edge to it that made me look up immediately. "Hey, is that a bear over there?" He pointed across to the far side of the lake. I squinted, shielding my eyes from the sun's reflection on the water. The lake wasn't huge, maybe a kilometer across at that point, but it was far enough that I couldn't make out details clearly. I could see something dark moving along the tree line on the opposite shore. "Probably," Mom said, not sounding too concerned. Bears weren't uncommon in the area. Kevin kept watching, then said, "Wait, something's off." I remember feeling the first prickle of unease. Kevin was an experienced outdoorsman. If something struck him as strange, it usually was. Mom and I both stopped fishing and looked more carefully. That's when I realized what Kevin had already noticed. The figure was walking on 2 legs, not 4. At first I thought maybe it was another hiker or camper, but something about the way it moved just felt wrong. The stride was too long, the posture not quite right. "That's not a bear," I said quietly, instinctively pulling Dylan closer to me. "And it's not a person either," Kevin added. His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. The figure was moving steadily along the shoreline, and as I watched, I realized with a shock that it was heading in our direction, not directly, but following the curve of the lake. And it was moving fast, much faster than someone should be able to travel through that kind of terrain. Mom stood up, her fishing rod forgotten. "How big do you think it is?" Kevin swallowed. "Big, at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller." What struck me most was the color. Most of the Bigfoot stories I'd heard describe brown creatures, but this thing was a strange mix of gray and black. The gray seemed to dominate its upper body, while its lower half was darker. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive. Broad shoulders, powerful build. "We should head back to camp," Mom said firmly, already gathering her gear. There wasn't any panic in her voice, but I could tell she was unsettled. Mom had grown up in rural areas and wasn't easily spooked by wildlife. Dylan, sensing our anxiety, started asking questions, but I hushed him gently and told him we were going to have lunch back at camp. I didn't want to scare him, but I couldn't take my eyes off the creature as we packed up. It never dropped to all fours, never moved like any animal I'd ever seen. Its gait was purposeful, almost determined. We moved quickly, not running, but definitely hurrying. I kept looking back over my shoulder, but the dense trees along the path back to our campsite soon blocked my view of the lake. The whole way back, I felt like we were being watched. My skin was crawling with that feeling you get when you know something isn't right. Back at camp, we tried to act normal for Dylan's sake, but Kevin kept scanning the tree line, and Mom locked the coolers in the car, something we never usually bothered with until nighttime because of bears. Dad wasn't due back until evening, so we spent the afternoon close to camp, playing cards and trying to ignore the sense of unease that hung over us. Around 4 in the afternoon, Kevin announced he was going to take our garbage to the disposal pit. It was about 1 kilometer away from our campsite, down an old logging road. "I'll be quick," he promised, grabbing the trash bags. Mom looked worried. "Maybe wait until your father gets back." Kevin shook his head. "It's fine. It'll be crowded later when everyone's back from fishing." I didn't like it, but Kevin was an adult, and honestly, in the daylight, with the bright sun overhead, my earlier fears started to seem silly. Maybe it had been a bear standing up momentarily, or just another hiker after all. Kevin was only gone about 20 minutes, but when he came back, I knew immediately something was wrong. His face was completely drained of color. I'm not exaggerating when I say he looked white as a ghost. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped the car keys twice trying to lock the vehicle after tossing in the empty garbage bags. "What happened?" I asked, jumping up from the picnic table. Kevin just shook his head, his eyes wide. "We need to wait for Dad." Mom tried to get him to talk, but he wouldn't say anything else. He just sat at the table, staring into the woods, jumping at every sound. Dylan, picking up on the tension, became clingy and whiny. The hours until Dad returned were some of the longest of my life. When Dad's truck finally rumbled into camp around 6:30, Kevin immediately pulled him aside. They had a brief, intense conversation that I couldn't hear, and then they both got into Dad's truck and drove off. Mom and I exchanged worried glances. "What do you think is going on?" I asked her. She shook her head. "I don't know, but your brother saw something that scared him badly." They were gone maybe 40 minutes. When they returned, Dad looked grim, and Kevin still looked shaken, but somehow relieved to have someone else confirm whatever he'd found. Dad gathered us around the campfire that evening after Dylan had fallen asleep in the tent. His voice was low and serious. "Kevin found some prints near the garbage pit," he said. "I've never seen anything like them before." "Prints?" Mom echoed. "Like footprints?" Dad nodded slowly. "Barefoot. Human-shaped but massive. Much bigger than any man I've ever met." Kevin added, "They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud near the backside of the pit where nobody ever goes." Dad continued, I measured them against my boot. Each print was at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The stride length, he paused, looking troubled, was well over 4 feet between steps. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the fire. "Did you take pictures?" I asked. Dad shook his head. Neither of us had a camera. I tried making a cast with some plaster I had in my truck, but it was old and didn't set right. "What about the thing we saw at the lake?" I asked, looking at Kevin and Mom. "Could it be the same, whatever it was?" Kevin nodded. "Has to be. The timing matches. It was heading in this general direction." "What exactly did you see at the lake?" Dad asked, his forehead creasing with concern. We described it as best we could. The upright walking, the unusual gray and black coloring, the unnatural speed and fluidity of movement. Dad was quiet for a long time after we finished. Finally, he said, "I've been working in these woods for 30 years, and I've never seen or heard anything like that. But Jim, one of the indigenous guys on the fire crew, he told me once about something his grandfather called the Tall One. Said it lived in the deepest parts of the forest and could cover miles in a day." The fire popped loudly, making us all jump. Dad looked at each of us in turn. "We're leaving at first light tomorrow," he said firmly. "I'll call in sick if I have to." No one argued. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, Mom went to check on Dylan, and Dad started securing the campsite for the night, double-checking the food storage and making sure nothing was left out that might attract animals. I stayed by the fire with Kevin. "Are you okay?" I asked him quietly. He shook his head slightly. "When I was at the garbage pit, before I saw the footprints, I heard something." "What kind of something?" "A sound like, I don't know how to describe it, like a low moan, but deeper than anything a human could make. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once." He swallowed hard. "And there was a smell, Mer, like wet dog mixed with something rotten." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. "Why didn't you tell Mom and Dad about that part?" He glanced toward the tent where Dylan was sleeping. "Didn't want to freak everyone out more than they already were, but I swear, I felt like it was watching me the whole time, like it could have grabbed me if it wanted to." We didn't sleep much that night. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us wide awake, straining to hear. I kept Dylan close to me in our tent, listening to his steady breathing and trying to convince myself that morning would come quickly. Around 3 in the morning, we all heard it. A series of wood knocks, like someone hitting a tree with a heavy stick. 3 distinct knocks, then silence, then 3 more. They seemed to come from beyond the garbage pit, maybe half a kilometer away. Dad had his hunting rifle ready, though he later admitted he wasn't sure what good it would do. The knocking continued intermittently for almost an hour, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes farther away. Then, just before dawn, there was a scream that made my blood run cold. It started like a wolf's howl, but transformed into something eerily human-like before dropping to a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath us. I've heard cougars and bears and all sorts of wildlife, but nothing that sounded remotely like that. We broke camp in record time once daylight came. Dylan, thankfully, had slept through most of the night's events, though he picked up on our anxiety and was unusually quiet as we packed. As we were loading the last of our gear, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. At the edge of our campsite, where the cleared area met the forest, 3 small trees had been broken, not cut or sawed, but snapped about halfway up their trunks, maybe 8 feet off the ground. The tops were bent over and pointing toward our camp. The breaks were fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and damp. Most disturbing of all, they were arranged in a perfect line, evenly spaced, like some kind of marker or message. Dad saw me staring and came over. He examined the broken trees without touching them, his face grim. "That wasn't like that yesterday," he said quietly. We left within 20 minutes after that, driving faster than was probably safe on those rough logging roads. Nobody spoke much until we were back on the paved highway, heading toward civilization. Over the years, I've tried researching what we might have encountered. The descriptions of Sasquatch or Bigfoot seem closest, though the grey and black colouring isn't commonly reported. I've read about territorial markings, the wood knocks, the tree breaks, all consistent with what we experienced. My father passed away 6 years ago, but until the end, he refused to go back to Hag Lake or anywhere near that area. Kevin moved to Ontario shortly after the incident, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the Alberta wilderness. Mom still lives in Calgary but doesn't like to talk about what happened. As for me, I still go camping and hiking, but never alone, and never in that part of Alberta. I've never told Dylan the full story. He was too young to remember much, and I don't want to color his love of the outdoors with my fear. I don't know what we encountered that August day in 1988. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it away. But when I hear twigs snapping in the forest or catch a glimpse of movement just beyond my peripheral vision, I remember the thing by the lake, walking upright, moving with purpose, grey and black against the tree line. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting in the deep woods of northern Alberta. Story 10. I've held this story inside for way too long. It's been 32 years and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. June 1991. I was 22. My brother Daniel was 24, and my roommate Jordan was 23. We'd planned a hiking trip with the Wilson brothers, Rich, Mike, and Tom, who brought their German Shepherd Rocket. We were all pretty experienced hikers, so we decided to tackle the Stanley Glacier Trail near Lake Louise, right on the Alberta-BC border. The morning started like any other hiking day. We parked at the trailhead around 9 in the morning. It was damp and cloudy, typical mountain weather. Not super cold, but definitely not warm either. I remember wearing my navy blue fleece over a long-sleeve shirt and my trusty hiking pants with all the pockets. We all had our day packs with water, energy bars and rain shells just in case. The hike up was uneventful, beautiful for sure. The kind of scenery that makes you glad to be alive. There was still snow at higher elevations, which made for some stunning views. We took our time, stopping occasionally to catch our breath and snap a few photos on my old Canon. Jordan kept racing ahead. He was always the fittest of our group. Daniel stayed close behind him while I hung back a bit, taking in the views. The Wilson brothers trailed behind me with Rocket, who was having the time of his life, darting back and forth on the trail and occasionally disappearing into the underbrush to investigate some intriguing scent. We made it to the glacier viewpoint and stopped for lunch. Everyone was in good spirits, joking around, comparing hiking stories. I remember looking at my watch. It was around 1 in the afternoon. After about 45 minutes, we packed up and started our descent. That's when everything changed. We kept the same order going down, Jordan in front, then Daniel, then me, with the Wilsons and Rocket bringing up the rear. We were probably spaced about 20 yards apart, sometimes more when Jordan would pull ahead on the steeper sections. The trail wound through a pine forest, and it was quiet except for our footsteps and occasional conversation. The ground was damp from recent rain, and there was a small pond or alpine lake about 10 minutes back up the trail. We'd been descending for maybe an hour, probably 2/3 of the way back to the trailhead, when I heard commotion ahead of me. There was a bend in the trail that blocked my view, but I heard shouting, not scared shouting, more surprised. I figured maybe someone had slipped or seen some wildlife, a moose or something. Before I could reach the bend, Rocket came tearing past me, heading toward whatever was causing the commotion. Right behind him were the Wilson brothers trying to call him back. Rich's face looked weird as he passed me, kind of shocked, kind of confused. "What's going on?" I called out. but they were focused on catching Rocket and just waved me forward. When I rounded the bend, I saw Daniel and Jordan standing completely still, staring into the trees to the right of the trail. They were pointing and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Jordan had his camera out, but was just holding it, like he'd forgotten how to use it. "What is it?" I asked, joining them. Daniel turned to me, his face pale. "Did you see it?" "See what?" "I don't know. I thought it was a kid at first, but..." Just then, I caught movement in the forest, something large crashing through the underbrush. It was moving fast, making the pine branches sway. Rocket was barking like crazy, chasing after whatever it was. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw makes no sense to this day. It was tall, at least 6 feet, with long, matted hair that looked blonde or light brown in the filtered forest light. The hair covered its entire back. It wasn't wearing clothes, but it wasn't a bear or any animal I recognized. It moved in a way that was both human-like and not, kind of loping, but also powerful and deliberate. "What the actual hell was that?" I whispered. Daniel's voice shook. "It came down that slope over there." He pointed to a steep incline to our right, and just jumped across the path. Like, it didn't even slow down, just leapt from there to there. He pointed from the slope to a precarious area on the other side of the trail where the ground dropped off sharply. Jordan finally spoke. "No human could make that jump. Not from that angle, not landing where it did." The Wilson brothers had caught up to us now, but Rocket was still in pursuit, his barking getting more distant, but still audible. "Should we go after him?" Tom asked, clearly worried about his dog. None of us moved for a second. Then Mike said, "We have to. That's our dog." We reluctantly headed in the direction Rocket had disappeared. The forest was thick here, with fallen logs and dense underbrush making progress difficult. We kept calling for Rocket, but he wasn't coming back. After about 50 yards of struggling through the forest, we heard Rocket's barking change. It became more stationary, more focused, like he had something cornered or treed. "He's got it somewhere," Rich said. We pushed forward another 25 yards or so, and the trees thinned out enough that we could see better. Rocket was at the base of a large, partially burnt pine tree, barking up at it furiously. The tree looked old and damaged, probably from a lightning strike or forest fire years ago. We couldn't see anything in the tree from where we stood. I strained my eyes looking for movement, for any sign of what Rocket was so fixated on, but I couldn't spot anything through the branches. "Maybe it climbed up," Tom suggested, his voice barely audible over Rocket's barking. Then we heard it, a creaking sound from the tree, not like branches swaying in the wind, but a deep, structural groaning, the kind of sound a tree makes when it's about to fall. We all froze. The creaking came again, louder this time. Rocket kept barking. "Rocket, come here, boy!" Mike called desperately. The tree creaked a third time. From our slight elevation, we could see the base of the tree shifting ever so slightly. Whatever was up there was heavy enough to affect the stability of a full-grown pine. Then came the fourth creak, followed immediately by a thunderous crack. The tree began to fall, not toward us, thankfully, but parallel to where we stood. It hit the ground with incredible force, sending up a cloud of pine needles and dirt. The impact momentarily silenced Rocket, and in that silence, we heard nothing. No movement, no creature, nothing. After a few seconds, Rocket started barking again, but he was moving now, circling the fallen tree, sniffing frantically. Whatever had been there was gone. "Jesus Christ!" Rich whispered. "Did you see how that tree just fell?" "Something pushed it over," Jordan said. "Something strong." The realization of what he was implying hit us all at once. We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. Whatever we'd encountered, it wasn't human. No human could have made that jump across the trail. No human could have climbed that tree so quickly, and definitely no human could have pushed over a mature pine tree. "We need to go," Daniel said firmly. "Now." No one argued. Mike called for Rocket again, and this time the dog came running back, clearly agitated but unharmed. We made our way back to the trail as quickly as we could, stumbling over roots and branches in our haste. Once back on the trail, we practically jogged the rest of the way down. No one wanted to be the last in line anymore, so we stayed tightly grouped. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We didn't talk much on the way down, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd witnessed. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that anyone spoke about it directly. "That was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" Tom asked, his voice surprisingly steady. None of us immediately responded. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that felt dangerous, like naming it might summon it back. "I don't know what else it could have been," Jordan finally said. "It had hair all over it," Daniel added, "long blonde hair. And it moved wrong, not like a person." "The jump," I said, remembering. "No human could have made that jump. The angle was all wrong, and the landing spot was practically a cliff." We stood there in the parking lot for a while, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Rich suggested it might have been a weird-looking bear, but none of us believed it. Bears don't have long blonde hair. They don't move the way this thing moved. And they definitely don't climb trees and push them over when threatened. The drive home was quiet. We promised to meet up the next day to talk more, but when we did, something had changed. The Wilson brothers seemed reluctant to discuss it, almost embarrassed. Jordan showed us the photos he'd taken on the hike, but there was nothing of our encounter. He'd been too shocked to use his camera when it mattered. Over the next few weeks, we all kind of drifted apart. Not deliberately, but the experience had shaken us in ways we couldn't articulate. The Wilson brothers moved to Calgary that fall, and I lost touch with them. Jordan and I remained roommates until I got married in 1993, but we rarely spoke about what happened on the Stanley Glacier Trail. To this day, I haven't been back there. I still hike, but I stick to popular trails now, places where there are lots of other people around. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and hear a branch snap, I freeze, half expecting to see a tall, hair-covered figure darting through the trees. The memory hasn't faded at all in 32 years. I've read accounts of other Sasquatch sightings since then, and some details match what we saw: the height, the hair, the incredible strength and agility. But nothing I've read explains why it was there, in that specific place, at that specific time, or why it seemed to deliberately push over that tree. Was it trying to scare us off? Was it protecting something? Was it just afraid? I don't have answers. I just know what 6 grown men and 1 dog witnessed that cloudy June day in 1991. Something not human, something that shouldn't exist but does, something that's probably still out there in those mountains, watching hikers from the trees, deciding whether to reveal itself or remain hidden. Sometimes I wonder if any of the others ever talk about it, if they wake up in the middle of the night like I occasionally do, with the sound of that tree creaking and falling echoing in their ears. If they've spent decades, like I have, trying to convince themselves there's a rational explanation and failing every time. All I know is what I saw, and what I saw wasn't human, not even close. Story 11. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night in September of 1993. Even after all these years, I've never been able to fully explain it, and I've certainly never forgotten it. The experience changed me forever, and not in a good way. I was 16 that fall, excited to be spending a weekend at Camp Alexo with our church youth group. The camp was pretty remote, nestled in the Alberta wilderness west of Rocky Mountain House and east of Nordegg. It was beautiful country, tall pines, mountains in the distance, crisp autumn air, the kind of place where you'd expect to feel peace. Instead, it became the setting for the most terrifying night of my life. There were about 18 of us that weekend, all teenagers except for Jackson Miller, our 25-year-old youth counselor. Jackson was the cool counselor type, laid back, always up for an adventure, the kind of guy who'd bend the rules if it meant we'd have a good time. He'd been to Camp Alexo many times before and knew the area well. We arrived Friday afternoon, settled into our cabins, separate ones for boys and girls, and spent the day doing typical camp activities: hiking, playing games, cooking hot dogs over the fire. Nothing unusual happened that first day. I remember feeling happy, relaxed, connected to nature and my friends, if only it had stayed that way. Saturday was more of the same, normal camp stuff. But after dinner, as we sat around the campfire, Jackson got this look in his eyes that I'd come to recognize as his "I've got an idea" face. "Hey, who wants to go on a night hike?" he asked, looking around at all our faces glowing in the firelight. "There's this old cemetery not far from here, really cool historic spot." Most of us were immediately on board. I mean, what teenager doesn't want to explore a cemetery at night? A couple of the girls seemed nervous, but peer pressure did its thing, and eventually we were all in. It was around 9:30 when we grabbed our flashlights and set off. Jackson led the way as we headed down the hill past the boys' cabin. The moon was only a sliver that night, and once we got away from the campfire and cabin lights, it was seriously dark. The kind of darkness you only experience when you're far from civilization. We reached a set of old railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill. They weren't used anymore, at least not regularly, just rusty rails cutting through the forest. Jackson directed us to turn left, and we walked single file along the tracks. Our flashlight beams bounced around in the darkness, lighting up trees and undergrowth on either side of us. The forest seemed to close in as we walked, and the sounds changed. Fewer cricket chirps, more mysterious rustles and creaks. "The cemetery is just up ahead," Jackson told us, his voice sounding strangely muted in the dense forest. "It's from the old logging days. Some of the graves date back to the 1800s. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came to a clearing where the forest opened up. And there it was, the cemetery. It wasn't large, maybe 30 headstones in total, surrounded by a low, crumbling stone wall. Some of the graves had proper headstones, while others were marked with simple wooden crosses that looked like they might collapse any minute. Jackson encouraged us to explore, saying it was perfectly safe and respectful as long as we didn't step on any graves or disturb anything. We split up into small groups, shining our flashlights on the weathered headstones, trying to make out the names and dates. The oldest one I found was from 1872, some poor logger who died in an accident. I remember feeling a deepening sense of unease as we explored, not because of the cemetery itself, but because the forest around us had gone completely silent. No wind in the trees, no animals, nothing, just our hushed voices and the sound of our feet on the leaf-covered ground. We spent maybe 30 minutes in that cemetery before Jackson announced it was time to head back. It was fully dark by then, and the temperature had dropped considerably. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. As we made our way back to the railroad tracks, I noticed how quiet everyone had become. The excited chatter from earlier had died down. Maybe we were all just tired, or maybe others felt that same strange unease I did. Either way, we walked in near silence, our flashlights creating a bobbing line of light as we followed the tracks back toward camp. We'd been walking for about 10 minutes when it happened. Melissa, a girl I knew from school but wasn't particularly close with, was near the back of our group. Suddenly, she let out this blood-curdling scream that made every hair on my body stand up. We all whipped around, some of us nearly losing our footing on the railroad ties. Melissa was frozen in place, her flashlight beam pointed up at something off to the side of the tracks. I'll never forget the look of pure terror on her face, illuminated by the reflected light. "What is that?" she kept saying, her voice trembling. "What is that?" We all directed our flashlights where she was pointing. About 50 feet from the tracks stood what I first thought was some kind of water tower or fire lookout, a tall structure reaching up maybe 50 feet into the darkness. But what made my stomach drop was what was perched on top of it. In the converging beams of our flashlights, we could make out a massive figure crouched at the tower's peak. It was hard to determine exact size from that distance, but it was big, way bigger than a human. It seemed to be covered in dark hair or fur that moved slightly in the light breeze. "Holy shit," Jackson whispered beside me, and hearing our usually confident counselor sound scared, absolutely terrified me. For a few seconds, we all stood frozen, flashlights trained on this thing. Then it moved. God, how it moved. The creature straightened up to its full height, which seemed enormous even from our distance. And then it did something I still can't comprehend. It jumped, not climbed down, not fell. It deliberately jumped from that 50-foot tower to the ground below. But here's the part that haunts me. It jumped with the casual ease of someone stepping off a curb, like gravity was just a suggestion it could ignore. As it leaped, our flashlights caught the silhouette of its extended arms with hair hanging down, almost like it was gliding. It hit the ground with a thud we could hear even from where we stood. There was no recovery time, no impact absorption. It landed and immediately took off running into the surrounding forest. We could hear branches and small trees snapping as it crashed through the underbrush. The sound of its passage through the forest faded, and for what felt like an eternity, we all stood there in shocked silence. No one spoke, no one moved. I don't think any of us were even breathing. Then, piercing the night like a physical force, came the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. A scream, but not human, not animal, not anything I could identify. High-pitched, yet somehow deep at the same time, it echoed through the forest and seemed to go on forever. It wasn't a roar or a howl. It was a deliberate vocalization that felt intelligent, like it was meant to communicate something specific to us. And then, as the scream faded, the smell hit us. I've tried for years to describe this smell accurately, and I still can't quite capture it. It was rancid, musky, like something long dead mixed with wet dog, and something else, something chemical almost. It was so strong, it made my eyes water and my throat close up. "Back to camp," Jackson finally said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Now, stay together. Move fast." We didn't need to be told twice. We practically ran back along those tracks, stumbling in our haste, flashlight beams jerking wildly. No one spoke. The only sounds were our ragged breathing and feet pounding on the ground. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see that thing emerging from the trees behind us. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. A bear? No bear moves like that. A person in a costume? Impossible. No human could survive that jump, let alone run off immediately afterward. The walk back to camp felt 10 times longer than the walk out. Every shadow held potential danger. Every sound in the forest seemed sinister. When we finally reached the bottom of the hill and saw the cabins above us, I nearly collapsed with relief. We all scrambled up the hill, not stopping until we reached the main cabin. Jackson herded us all inside, locked the door behind us, and immediately started checking that all windows were secure. Once inside, the questions started flying. Everyone talking at once, voices high and strained. What was that thing? Did you see how it jumped? That scream, oh my God, that scream. It had to be 8 feet tall at least. Jackson tried to calm everyone down, but I could tell he was shaken too. His hands trembled as he made hot chocolate for everyone, insisting we all stay in the main cabin rather than returning to our separate sleeping quarters. As we huddled together, still processing what had happened, Jackson revealed something that made the whole experience even more unsettling. He went to a bookshelf in the corner of the cabin and pulled down a large binder. "I didn't want to freak you guys out before," he explained, but Camp Alexo has a history. I've heard stories from other counselors, but I never really believed them until now. He opened the binder to reveal newspaper clippings, typed accounts, and even some blurry photographs, all documenting strange sightings in the area going back decades. Stories of hikers, campers, and locals encountering large, hair-covered creatures in the forests around the camp. Some of the accounts described exactly what we'd experienced: the impossible jumping ability, the terrifying scream, the distinctive odor. One article from 1978 described a family of 4 who abandoned their campsite in the middle of the night after something over 7 feet tall circled their tent for hours, occasionally reaching out to touch the fabric with long, clawed fingers. A photograph from 1985 showed a set of footprints in mud near the same railroad tracks we'd walked. A ruler placed alongside one print indicated it was nearly 16 inches long. We stayed up most of the night, too terrified to sleep. Several parents were called. This was before everyone had cell phones, so Jackson had to use the camp's landline. And by morning, about half of our group had been picked up early. The rest of us stuck out the remainder of the weekend, but the carefree atmosphere was gone. We stayed close to the cabins, jumped at every sound, and counted the hours until we could leave. Before we departed on Sunday, Jackson made us all promise not to spread wild stories about what had happened. "People won't understand," he said. "They'll think we're making it up or exaggerating." For the most part, we kept that promise. I told my parents we'd gone on a night hike and gotten spooked by noises in the forest, a heavily watered-down version of the truth, but I never told them about the creature, the jump, or that blood-chilling scream. In the weeks that followed, our group drifted apart. It was like we couldn't face each other without remembering that night. Jackson quit his position as youth counselor a month later, citing personal reasons. I heard he moved out of Alberta entirely. I've spent nearly 30 years trying to rationalize what I saw that night. I've researched wildlife native to Alberta, looked into optical illusions, mass hysteria, everything I could think of. But I've found no explanation that fits what 18 people witnessed together. I've never returned to Camp Alexo. I've never gone camping again, period. I still can't sleep with my window open, even in summer, and to this day, certain smells like wet dog or rotting leaves can trigger such intense panic attacks that I have to sit down until they pass. I don't know what we encountered that September night in 1993. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some unknown species, the label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it wanted us to know it was there. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, in those dark woods between Rocky Mountain House and Nordegg, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear that scream echoing from the distant past, a sound that will haunt me until my dying day. Story 12. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that day in July of '95. It's been almost 3 decades, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, you know. My name is Olivia, and I was 23 then, hiking with my friend Melissa in Jasper National Park. We weren't exactly experienced hikers, but we weren't complete novices either. We'd done some trails around Alberta before, but Sulfur Ridge was new territory for us. We were young, adventurous, and honestly a bit naive about the wilderness. Our plan was simple: hike to the summit, take some pictures of the gorgeous landscape and hot springs, then head back down before sunset. The day started perfectly. Clear blue skies, temperature in the mid-70s, just perfect hiking weather. We packed light, just water, some granola bars, my camera, an old Nikon my dad had given me for my birthday, and a small first aid kit. Our roommate Jen had insisted on the first aid kit. "You never know what might happen out there," she'd said. Looking back, I wish we'd packed more. The first couple hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail was well maintained at the beginning, and we passed a few other hikers heading back down. An older couple warned us about a section of the trail that had partially collapsed due to recent rainfall, but assured us it was still passable if we were careful. Around 4 in the afternoon, we reached that collapsed section. The trail narrowed significantly, with a steep drop-off to our right. Below, we could see the steaming hot springs that made this area famous. The view was breathtaking, and I remember feeling so alive in that moment, that peculiar mix of accomplishment and awe that nature sometimes gifts you. "Let's take a break here," Melissa suggested, and I agreed. My calves were burning anyway, and I wanted to get some photos of the springs from this vantage point. We sat on some rocks, drank some water, and I pulled out my camera. The lighting was perfect, that late afternoon glow that photographers dream about. I was adjusting my zoom to capture the springs when something caught my eye at the summit above us. At first, I thought it was just another hiker. That's the logical assumption, right? See a figure on a hiking trail. It's probably a hiker. I even waved instinctively, thinking we'd probably pass them on the trail later. "Hey, there's someone up there," I said to Melissa, pointing. I even raised my camera, framing them in the viewfinder, but decided against taking the shot. It felt weird to photograph a stranger from a distance. When the figure didn't wave back or move, I lowered my camera and squinted for a better look. That's when I felt the first twinge of unease crawl up my spine. "That doesn't look like a person," I remember whispering. Melissa stood up beside me, shielding her eyes from the sun. The figure was far enough away that details weren't crystal clear, but close enough that we could make out the basic shape. And what we saw didn't make sense. It was tall, really tall, and covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur. But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that for extended periods. This thing was standing on 2 legs, completely vertical, with proportions that resembled a human's. "What the hell is that?" Melissa whispered. Neither of us moved. Neither of us even blinked, I think. For several minutes we just stared at it, and it seemed to be staring back, though I couldn't make out any facial features at that distance. It was just standing there, completely still, about 100 yards up from us near the summit of the ridge. Then it moved. And when it moved, everything I thought I knew about wildlife and the natural world got turned upside down. This thing, whatever it was, began running. Not walking, not lumbering, but full-on sprinting directly down the face of the mountain. It bypassed the switchback trails entirely. For reference, the section it was descending was almost vertical in places, covered in loose rock and gravel. No human could navigate that route, especially not at that speed. My first thought was that maybe it was some crazy extreme mountain biker with a death wish. But there was no bike, and no human could move like that. "Is that a bear?" Melissa asked, her voice tight with fear. "No," I said immediately. "Bears don't run like that. They don't stand like that." And as the creature reached the tree line, it became painfully obvious this wasn't a bear. It was taller than the surrounding trees. The pines at that elevation were easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and this thing towered above them as it passed. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even raise my camera, not that it would have mattered. The thing was moving so fast I doubt I could have captured anything but a blur. Within moments, it had disappeared into the denser forest below. Melissa and I stood there in stunned silence. I remember the bizarre normalcy of the moment, birds still chirping, the wind still rustling through the pines, the hot springs still steaming below us. It was as if nature hadn't even noticed the impossible thing we'd just witnessed. "Did you see that?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible. Melissa nodded slowly, her face pale. "What do we do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when you see something that shouldn't exist, something your brain can't categorize or explain? Strangely, we decided to keep hiking. I think we were in shock, honestly. Neither of us suggested turning back. We didn't even discuss what we'd seen. It was like our brains were protecting us from the reality of it, compartmentalizing the experience until we could process it safely. We continued toward the summit, though we moved slower now, constantly scanning our surroundings. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every rustle in the underbrush froze us in our tracks. But we didn't see the creature again, at least not then. When we reached the elevation where we'd first spotted the figure, I fully realized the impossibility of what we'd witnessed. The mountain face it had descended was practically vertical in places, covered in loose scree and gravel that shifted under your feet even on the established trail. No human could have run down that. They would have tumbled to their death. The route the creature took was completely inaccessible to humans. No trails, no footholds, nothing but steep, unstable terrain. And those trees, seeing them up close, hammered home just how massive this thing had been. The pines at the tree line were easily over 7 feet tall. The creature had stood head and shoulders above them. We reached the summit around 6:30. The view was spectacular. A sweeping panorama of the Canadian Rockies, valleys and rivers spread out before us. But neither of us could fully appreciate it. We took a few perfunctory photos, ate a granola bar each in silence, and started our descent much earlier than we'd planned. The way down was tense. The sun was still up. We had plenty of daylight left, but every shadow seemed menacing now. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, expecting to see that tall, dark figure watching us. About halfway down, Melissa grabbed my arm so suddenly I nearly fell. "Did you hear that?" she hissed. I hadn't heard anything, but the look on her face made my heart race. We stood perfectly still, listening, and then I heard it too. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush parallel to the trail, just out of sight. "It's following us," I whispered, and as soon as I said it, I knew it was true. We picked up our pace, no longer even trying to be quiet. The sounds kept pace with us, sometimes falling behind only to suddenly appear ahead of us. Whatever was tracking us knew these woods far better than we did. As the trail widened near the bottom, we broke into a full run. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot where my old Honda Civic was waiting. We practically dove into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. Only then did we look at each other and acknowledge what had happened. "What the fuck was that thing?" Melissa asked, her voice cracking. I shook my head. I had no answer. Nothing in my limited knowledge of wildlife could explain what we'd seen. The drive back to our apartment in Edmonton was mostly silent. I think we were both trying to rationalize the experience, to fit it into our understanding of the world. But there was no fitting it. It existed outside the boundaries of what we thought was possible. When we got home, our roommates Jen and Tyler were watching TV. They could immediately tell something was wrong. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," Jen said, muting the television. We told them everything: the figure at the summit, the impossible descent down the mountain face, the thing following us on our way back. I expected disbelief, maybe even laughter, but Tyler's expression grew serious. "Sounds like you saw a Sasquatch," he said, and he wasn't joking. Tyler was from British Columbia originally, and he told us that stories of Bigfoot or Sasquatch were common in the more remote areas. Indigenous communities had legends dating back centuries of large, hair-covered beings that lived in the deep wilderness. "My uncle swears he saw one when he was logging near Prince George," Tyler told us. "Said it was at least 8 feet tall with a face that was somehow both human and not." I'd always dismissed Bigfoot stories as campfire tales or misidentifications of bears, but after what we'd seen that day, I couldn't be so sure anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure running down the impossible slope, moving with a speed and agility that defied explanation. I kept replaying the sounds in the forest, wondering what would have happened if we hadn't made it back to the car before dark. The next morning, I was surprised when Melissa suggested we go back. "Are you insane?" I asked her. "We need to know," she insisted. "We need proof. Otherwise, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering if we imagined the whole thing." She had a point, and so, against all common sense, we drove back to Jasper that day. This time we brought Tyler's old camcorder. If we saw the creature again, we'd have evidence. The trail seemed different in the morning light, less mysterious, more mundane. We hiked cautiously, cameras ready, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. We returned to the spot where we'd first seen the figure, but there was nothing unusual, just mountains, trees, and the occasional chipmunk or bird. We found no footprints, no hair caught on branches, nothing to indicate that the creature had ever existed. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was frustrated. Had we hallucinated the whole thing? But as we began our descent around 4 in the afternoon, the forest atmosphere changed. The birds went quiet. The wind seemed to still. That sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. "It's here," Melissa whispered, and I knew she was right. We never saw it that second day, but we felt it. Something was tracking us through the trees, maintaining a parallel course about 50 yards off the trail. Occasionally we'd hear branches snap or rocks clatter down a slope, sounds too substantial to be made by any small animal. As the shadows lengthened and the trail darkened under the canopy of trees, our nerve broke. We ran most of the way down, the heavy breathing and footfalls behind us matching our pace, always just out of sight. We reached the car just as dusk was settling in. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the tree line one last time. I can't be certain. The light was failing, and fear makes the mind play tricks. But I swear I saw a massive silhouette standing just inside the forest edge, watching us. It was only visible for a second before it stepped back into the deeper shadows and vanished. We never went back to Sulfur Ridge after that. I've hiked other trails, other parks, but something about that experience changed my relationship with the wilderness. I became acutely aware of how little we truly know about the remote corners of our world. How many mysteries might still be hiding in plain sight. In the years since, I've researched similar sightings in the Jasper area. There have been dozens, though most people don't report them officially. Who would believe them? Who wants to be labeled as crazy or attention-seeking? I still have the photos I took that day. Beautiful landscapes, the hot springs, Melissa smiling at the summit. But nothing of the creature. Sometimes I think that's for the best. Some things aren't meant to be captured or explained. They exist in the periphery of our understanding, reminding us that the world is vaster and stranger than we can imagine. I don't know what we saw on Sulfur Ridge that July day in '95. I can't explain how a bipedal creature over 8 feet tall could run straight down a mountain face that would kill any human who attempted it. I can't rationalize the feeling of being hunted through the forest by something intelligent enough to pace us without revealing itself. All I know is that I'm not alone in my experience. Others have seen it too, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, watching hikers from the summit of Sulfur Ridge, deciding whether to reveal itself or remain hidden in the ancient wilderness it calls home. Story 13. I'm still not sure I should be sharing this. For years, I've kept it mostly to myself, only telling a few close friends who probably thought I was exaggerating or flat out making it up. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened back in November of 1995. I was 27 at the time and had been hunting since I was a teenager. My dad taught me everything I knew about tracking game, reading the landscape, and respecting nature. We were out near Longview, Alberta, a place I knew like the back of my hand after spending nearly every hunting season there for over a decade. That day, Dad and I had driven out with his buddy Ron to track some mule deer. The The morning was brutally cold, probably around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sky was crystal clear and the sun made the fresh snow blindingly bright. We'd been out since dawn, moving quietly through the woods, following tracks and watching for movement. By early afternoon, we hadn't had any luck, which wasn't unusual. Hunting is mostly waiting and watching. Around 2 in the afternoon, we were taking a break near the eastern slope of a valley we'd hunted many times before. I was scanning the opposite hillside with my binoculars when I spotted 2 doe moving through a stand of trees on the western hill. They were perfect, legal game in season, and we'd been tracking deer all morning without success. "Dad," I whispered, lowering my binoculars. 2 doe across the valley, moving through those aspens. He looked where I was pointing and nodded. "I see 'em. Ron's still working his way around. Why don't you go after them? We'll catch up." I didn't hesitate. This was routine for us. Sometimes we hunted together, sometimes we split up to cover more ground. I grabbed my rifle, a Remington 30-06 I'd saved up for years to buy, checked my ammo, and started moving. The trek across the valley and up the other side was tough going. The snow was about 8 inches deep, and the hillside was steep in places. I kept my breathing steady and moved as quietly as I could, following a route that would keep me downwind of where I'd seen the deer. It took me about 15 minutes to get into position, working my way through mixed pine and spruce with patches of aspen groves scattered throughout. When I reached a good vantage point, I was about 200 yards downwind from where I'd last seen the doe. I found a fallen log to use as a rest for my rifle and settled in to watch. The forest was dead quiet, that special kind of silence that only happens in snow-covered woods. The only sound was my own breathing and the occasional soft crunch as I shifted my weight. After a few minutes of watching, I noticed the deer seemed spooked. Their heads were up, ears alert, and they kept looking around nervously. I figured they might have caught my scent, even though I was downwind, or maybe they'd spotted movement. Either way, I knew they were about to bolt. I lined up my shot on the larger doe, steadied my breathing, and squeezed the trigger. I missed. I don't miss often, but I did that day. The shot echoed through the valley, and both deer took off immediately, bounding through a small gully and disappearing around a cluster of trees. Frustrated but not discouraged, I got up and followed their tracks. This was part of hunting. Sometimes you miss, sometimes you follow for hours. I was prepared to track them for the rest of the day if necessary. But after about 10 minutes of following their trail, I lost them. The tracks led to a rocky patch where the snow was thin, and I couldn't pick up where they'd gone. I decided to climb higher to get a better view of the surrounding area, thinking I might spot them from above. That's when I emerged above this large open field, probably 200 yards wide and 800 yards long, covered in pristine snow. It was a beautiful sight, the kind that reminds you why you love being out in the wilderness, even on a freezing cold day. I found another fallen log, sat down, and pulled out my binoculars to scan the area. I was sweeping my view across the valley when I noticed movement at the edge of the forest on the far side of the field. At first, I just saw the trees shaking, not like when wind blows through them, but violently, like something big was pushing against them. I focused my binoculars on that spot and kept watching. Then something emerged from the forest edge. In that first moment, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing by fitting it into something familiar. I thought it must be another hunter, maybe someone trying to scare away the wildlife. But as I kept watching, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't human. It was too big, too fast, and it moved all wrong. The creature was running down the steep, snow-covered hill, swinging its arms over its head in a way no person would move. It was dark, not black, but a deep brown color that stood out starkly against the white snow. And it was tall, much taller than any man I've ever seen. 6.5, maybe 7 feet. What really got to me was the speed. This thing was covering ground in a way that didn't seem possible. The hillside was steep, so steep that when I tried to navigate it later, it took me a good 5 minutes of careful stepping and sliding to get down. This creature covered the entire field in maybe 10 seconds, moving in powerful strides that ate up the distance. I couldn't move, I just sat there, binoculars pressed to my eyes, completely frozen. It wasn't fear, exactly, at least not at first. It was more like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, couldn't fit it into any category I understood. I've seen bears, moose, elk, all the wildlife you'd expect in the Canadian wilderness. This wasn't any of those. It moved with purpose, with intelligence. The creature disappeared into the tree line on the opposite side of the field, and the spell broke. I lowered my binoculars, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I suddenly realized how exposed I was, sitting there on that log in the open. I gathered my gear and practically ran back the way I'd come, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. It took me about 20 minutes to make it back to where Dad and Ron were waiting. They could tell something was wrong the moment they saw me. My face must have been white as the snow, and I was breathing hard. "What happened?" Dad asked. "Did you get one?" I shook my head. "I saw something," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. At first, I thought it was a person, but it wasn't. It was running across that big field on the western slope, swinging its arms over its head. Ron laughed. "Probably just another hunter trying to scare the game your way," he said. "Or maybe someone saw you and was trying to mess with you." Dad didn't laugh. He knows me too well, knows I'm not the type to get spooked easily or to exaggerate. "What did it look like?" he asked quietly. I tried to describe it, but words felt inadequate. "How do you describe something you've never seen before? Something that doesn't fit into any category, you know?" I told them about its size, its color, the way it moved. I could tell Ron thought I was full of it, but Dad just nodded and said we should head back to the truck. We didn't talk much on the drive home. For the next week, I couldn't get the sighting out of my head. Certain details kept coming back to me, things that didn't make sense. I've been hunting these woods for over a decade. I know what people look like moving through snow. I know what animals look like. This was neither. The following Saturday, I convinced Dad to go back with me. I wanted to check out the spot where I'd seen the creature emerge from the forest. Ron declined to join us, making some excuse about chores around his house. When we got to the field, I led Dad to the place where I'd been sitting, then pointed out the path the creature had taken. We crossed the field together, and I showed him the aspen trees I had seen shaking before the thing appeared. They weren't saplings. These were mature trees, 9 inches in diameter and about 25 feet tall. It would take something with considerable strength to shake them the way I'd seen. "And you said it came down this slope?" Dad asked, looking at the steep hillside. "Yeah," I said. "It took me 5 minutes to get down carefully. Whatever I saw did it in seconds." Dad didn't say anything for a while, just stood there looking at the trees, the hill, the field. Finally, he put his hand on my shoulder. "I believe you saw something, son," he said. "I don't know what it was, but I believe you saw something." We looked for tracks, but a light snow had fallen during the week, covering any evidence that might have been there. Still standing in that spot, looking at the distance and terrain the creature had covered so easily, I felt the same chill run down my spine that I'd felt when I first saw it. On the drive back, Dad told me about stories he'd heard from other hunters and loggers in the area, strange sightings, unexplained sounds in the night, massive tracks found in remote areas. Most people kept these stories to themselves, afraid of being ridiculed, but they were out there. My experience wasn't unique. It's been over 25 years since that day, and I still go hunting every season. I still love being in the woods, still find peace in the quiet of a snow-covered forest. But I'm more aware now, more alert. I catch myself scanning the tree lines, looking for movement that doesn't belong. Sometimes when I'm alone in the wilderness. I feel like I'm being watched. I've never seen it again, whatever it was. But I know what I saw that day wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd encountered before or since. The way it moved, powerful, purposeful, intelligent, has stayed with me all these years. Some nights I still wake up thinking about those moments, about how this thing, this creature, had probably been watching me as I tracked the deer. How it might have been aware of me sitting there on that log, binoculars raised, witnessing something few people ever see. And sometimes I wonder, what would have happened if it had decided to come toward me instead of running across the field? I don't have any concrete evidence, no photos, no footprints, nothing I can point to and say, see, this proves what I saw. All I have is what I experienced that cold November afternoon in 1995, and the absolute certainty that what I encountered was real. I've researched similar sightings since then. Some people call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Others have different names for it. I don't know what to call it. I just know that for a brief moment, I glimpsed something that shouldn't exist according to what we're taught about the natural world. Something that moves through the wilderness with more familiarity and ease than any human could. And sometimes, when I'm out hunting and the forest goes completely silent, not even bird calls or the rustle of small animals, I wonder if it's nearby, watching and waiting, just as wild and mysterious as it was on that November day when our paths briefly crossed in the snowy wilderness of Alberta. Story 14. This happened back in June 1997 when I was 16. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear on everything I care about that what I'm about to tell you actually happened. I've spent over 25 years trying to make sense of it, and I still can't. My mum refuses to talk about it to this day. I grew up in Redwater, Alberta, small town, lots of woods, nothing special. That summer, I had landed my first real job at a fast food place in Fort Saskatchewan, which was about 30 minutes away. I worked the breakfast shift, so my mum had to drive me there at ungodly hours before her own job started. On this particular morning, we left home around 5 a.m. The sun was just coming up, and there was this light fog hanging over the road, not thick, just enough to make everything look a bit surreal. I remember it was chilly that morning, and I was half asleep in the passenger seat of my mum's old Chevy Cavalier. She had the radio on low, some morning talk show, I think, but neither of us was really listening. We were driving down this stretch of highway that cuts through dense forest. Back then, before all the oil field development cleared so much of it away, the trees came right up to the edge of the road in most places. It was always a bit creepy in the early morning, but you'd see wildlife sometimes, which was cool, usually deer or the occasional coyote. About 15 minutes into our drive, my mom suddenly slowed down and said, "Oh, crap." I sat up and looked ahead. There, in the middle of the highway, were what looked like two large animals lying on the asphalt. I wasn't surprised. We'd seen this before. Bears, coyotes, and other animals would sometimes lie on the road at night because the pavement held heat, especially in spring when mornings were still cold. My mum tapped the horn lightly, which is what you'd normally do to scare them off. What happened next? I still get goosebumps thinking about it. One of the creatures, and I say creatures because I still don't know what they were, immediately jumped to its feet. But it didn't just get up. It sprang up onto two legs and ran into the woods on the right side of the road, not on all fours like a bear or a coyote, on two legs, like a human. I remember saying, "Holy shit," and my mom actually didn't even scold me for swearing, which tells you how shocked she was. The second creature seemed confused, or maybe it had been sleeping more deeply. It scrambled up and started running on all fours down the center line of the road ahead of us. My mom had stopped the car completely by this point. We were both just watching, frozen. After a few seconds, maybe 20 feet ahead of us, this second creature also rose up onto two legs. It just stood up mid-run and started booking it on 2 feet. Then it followed the first one, veering off the road and disappearing into the trees. My mum was freaking out. I could see her hands shaking on the steering wheel. But me? I was fascinated. These weren't bears. I'd seen plenty of bears in my life, and bears don't move like that. Bears can stand on their hind legs, sure, but they don't run that way. And they definitely don't transition from running on 4 legs to running on 2 in a smooth motion like that. I unbuckled my seatbelt and grabbed the door handle. I wanted to see them closer. I wanted to know what they were. "What are you doing?" my mum practically screamed. "I want to see them," I said, already halfway out the door, even though the car was still moving slowly. My mum reached over and grabbed my coat, yanking me back into the seat. "Don't you dare! We're getting out of here!" She stepped on the gas hard and we peeled away. I twisted around in my seat, looking out the back window, but there was nothing more to see. Just empty road and silent trees. "What were those things?" I asked her. "Bears," she said firmly. "Just bears." But I knew she didn't believe that any more than I did. The whole drive to work, I couldn't stop talking about what we'd seen. I kept saying we should tell someone or go back later to look for tracks. My mum kept insisting they were just bears, but her voice was shaky and she kept checking the rearview mirror like she thought they might be following us. I tried to remember every detail I could. They weren't massive like you hear about in Bigfoot stories, not 8 or 9 feet tall. They were leaner but still powerful looking, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall when standing. One had brown hair covering its body, and the other one, the one that ran on all 4s at first, had this reddish hair that looked almost rusty in the morning light. Their hair wasn't thick and fluffy like a bear's. It looked kind of matted and patchy in places, almost mangy. When the second one was running on all 4s, it wasn't moving like a bear or a dog. It was moving more like an ape would, on its knuckles. And when they ran on 2 legs, they didn't stand completely upright. They had this slight forward bend, but they moved so fast, like sprinters taking huge strides. I'd never seen anything move that quickly through the woods. They were as fast as horses, but way more agile, ducking under branches without slowing down. The weirdest thing is that they made no sounds. No screams, no calls, no growls, nothing but this heavy breathing that reminded me of a winded horse. That's something that stuck with me all these years. The complete silence of the whole encounter, except for that breathing. I remember thinking they looked like tall, hairy teenagers. There was something almost, not quite human, but not fully animal either. Something in between. When I got to work that morning, I told everyone what I'd seen. My supervisor, this older guy named Rick, just laughed and said, "Sounds like you met the local Sasquatch family, kid." Everyone thought I was making it up or that I'd just seen bears. I stopped talking about it after a while because people were starting to make jokes. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. As soon as I got home that afternoon, I begged my dad to drive me back to that spot. He humored me, probably thinking I'd just seen some deer or something and got overexcited. We went to the approximate location. I say approximate because everything looked different in broad daylight, and my mom had driven away so quickly that I hadn't marked exactly where we'd been. We walked around for about an hour, searching the edge of the woods where I thought the creatures had disappeared. The ground was too hard and dry to show footprints. There were some broken branches and disturbed underbrush, but nothing conclusive. My dad pointed out that could have been caused by anything: deer, moose, even human hikers. "I know what I saw, Dad," I insisted. "They weren't bears." "I believe you saw something that spooked you," he said diplomatically. "But out here, in this light with the fog, things can look different than they are." When we got home, I tried to talk to my mum about it again. She shut me down immediately. "I don't want to discuss it," she said firmly. "They were bears. End of story." But I could tell she was still rattled. For weeks afterward, she refused to drive that route in the early morning. She made excuses to leave later, which meant I had to bike to work a few times. When I asked her why, she'd say she was tired or had errands to run first, but I knew the real reason. About a month later, I finally got her to admit something. We were alone in the kitchen, and I brought it up again, probably for the 20th time. "Mum, why won't you just admit those weren't bears?" She put down the dish she was washing and turned to look at me. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Noah, some things are better left alone. I don't know what we saw that morning, and I don't want to know. It doesn't fit into how the world is supposed to work, and thinking about it scares me. So please, can we just not?" That's the most she's ever said about it. To this day, if I bring it up, which I've only done a few times as an adult, she changes the subject or leaves the room. I did my own research over the years. I read books about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. I joined online forums where people shared similar experiences. Most of the accounts described much larger creatures than what we saw, massive, gorilla-like beings. But a few described seeing smaller, more agile creatures, sometimes in pairs or groups. What struck me most was learning how rare it is to see two of them together. Most sightings are of solitary creatures, and the different coloration, one brown, one reddish. That's unusual too. It makes me wonder if they were related somehow, maybe a parent and child, or siblings. The area where we saw them has changed a lot since 1997. The oil industry moved in and cleared large sections of forest for development. Sometimes I wonder if that's why they were there that morning. If they were being pushed out of their territory, forced to cross roads they'd normally avoid. I've gone back to that area many times over the years, hoping to see something again. I never have. Whatever they were, they're either gone now, or they've learned to stay well hidden. I know how this sounds. I know most people reading this will think I just saw some bears in the fog and let my imagination run wild, or that I'm making the whole thing up for attention. I don't really care. I know what I saw. Those weren't bears. They weren't any animal I'd ever seen before or have seen since. The way they moved, the way they transitioned from 4 legs to 2, the incredible speed and agility, it wasn't natural. Or maybe it was too natural. Something primal that doesn't belong in our world of highways and fast food jobs. The image of that second creature running down the center line of the road and then suddenly rising up onto 2 legs mid-stride, that's burned into my memory. I still see it in dreams sometimes. That fluid motion, that impossible transformation from animal to something almost human. I'm 39 years old now. I've got a good job, a family of my own. I'm not some conspiracy nut or attention seeker. But that morning in June 1997 changed how I see the world. It showed me that there are things out there that defy easy explanation, things that exist in the margins between what we know and what we don't want to know. Sometimes when I'm driving on a rural highway in the early morning, I catch myself scanning the road ahead, half hoping and half afraid I'll see them again. I never have, but I still slow down when I drive through wooded areas at dawn, and I never, ever honk my horn unless I absolutely have to. Whatever they were, I think about them often. I wonder if they're still out there, moving silently through what's left of the forests, avoiding roads and humans. I wonder if anyone else has seen them. I wonder if they remember us. The humans in the car who disturbed their rest that foggy morning, as clearly as I remember them. The strangest part is that I wasn't afraid when I saw them. My mom was terrified, but I just felt curious, amazed, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see, something secret and ancient, something that made the world bigger and stranger than I'd ever known it to be. And maybe that's why my mom refuses to talk about it, because once you've seen something like that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing the world is only what they teach you in school. You know there's more out there, hiding just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting while we speed by in our cars, telling ourselves comforting lies about bears on the road. Story 15. I've never really told this story to many people because, well, Who would believe a kid who says they saw Bigfoot? But I'm 34 now, and I still remember every detail like it happened yesterday, not 25 years ago. I've been reading other people's encounters on here for months, and I finally got the courage to share mine. It was June 1998, and I was 9 years old. My parents had signed me up for Camp Alexo near Nordegg in Alberta. I was nervous about going. It was my first time at any summer camp, and I didn't know anyone there. My mom kept saying it would be character building, and I'd make new friends. But all I felt was this knot in my stomach as they drove away. The first day wasn't too bad. We did introductions, settled into our cabins, made some crafts, and had a campfire. My counselor was this really energetic college student named Sarah, who wore her hair in a braid and had about 1 million friendship bracelets on her wrists. She seemed nice enough, and I got assigned a bottom bunk, which made me feel a little better since I was afraid of heights. The second day was when it happened. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, but not too hot. After lunch, the counselors announced we'd be playing a wide game. For those who don't know, a wide game is basically like a massive scavenger hunt or capture the flag type thing where you use the entire campgrounds. They split us into teams with colored bandanas. I got red and explained the rules. Nothing complicated. Find clues hidden around camp, solve the riddles, and be the first team to complete the challenge. We started off staying together as a team, but somewhere between checking off clue number 3 and looking for clue number 4, I got separated from the others. I'm not sure exactly how it happened. I think I stopped to tie my shoe, and when I looked up, they were gone. I wasn't too worried at first. I could hear voices and laughter echoing through the trees, so I figured I'd just head in that direction and catch up. The camp had these main buildings: the dining hall, the recreation center, then a bunch of cabins scattered around. I knew my team was heading toward Pioneer Cabin to find the next clue. I decided to take a shortcut through the woods between Webster and Pioneer Cabins. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards of forest, and I could see a clearing ahead that I thought was probably where Pioneer Cabin was. The forest was beautiful in that spot. Tall old pine and spruce trees that blocked out most of the direct sunlight. It created this dappled light effect on the forest floor, which was covered in moss, fallen pine needles, and little patches of grass. There were logs scattered everywhere, some so old they were just crumbling away into the ground. I was jogging, trying to catch up to my team, when my foot caught on one of those fallen logs. I went down hard, scraping my hands and knees on the rough ground. It didn't hurt too bad, but I was annoyed at myself for being so clumsy. I remember brushing pine needles and dirt off my palms as I stood up. That's when I felt it, this weird feeling, like when you think someone's watching you. The forest had gotten really quiet, no birds, no squirrels chattering, nothing. Just this heavy silence. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. Less than 10 feet away, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, was something, someone, I don't know. But it wasn't human, at least not entirely. It was huge, so tall. I was a short kid, maybe 4 feet tall then, and this thing was easily over 7 feet, maybe 8. Its hand, paw, was gripping the tree trunk, and the fingers were massive, easily twice the size of my dad's, who had the biggest hands I'd ever seen. The fur was dark brown, almost black in the shadowy forest, and it looked matted in places, like it needed a good brushing. Not slick and shiny like in movies or drawings, more like an old teddy bear that's been left outside for months. There were little twigs and what might have been burrs tangled in it. But it was the face I remember most clearly. That face has stayed with me for 25 years. It was almost human, but wrong somehow. The bone structure was too wide, like someone had taken a normal human face and stretched it outward. The nose was pinched and extended slightly, not flat like an ape's, but not quite human either. And the mouth, it was so wide, stretching almost from ear to ear, it seemed. The lips were thin, almost hidden under all that fur. The eyes, though, the eyes were what made me freeze in place. They were deep set under a prominent brow, and so dark I couldn't make out pupils, just these two intelligent, alert eyes staring right at me. There was something in that gaze. Not animal mindlessness, but awareness, recognition. It was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. We stood there, just staring at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I wasn't even scared at first, just completely shocked, like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It felt like looking at a puzzle where all the pieces were familiar, but when put together, they made a picture that shouldn't exist. Then my survival instincts kicked in. I screamed, this high-pitched, terrified scream that hurt my own ears. The creature's expression changed immediately. Its eyes widened, and it took a step back. It didn't roar or attack or anything like that. It just turned and walked away. Not running, not crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from something that big. It moved surprisingly quietly, just melting into the trees in a few long strides. I kept screaming, though. I couldn't stop. I was frozen in place, staring at the spot where it had been, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. My heart was beating so fast, I thought it might burst out of my chest. My whole body was trembling, and I felt this weird cold sweat break out all over. I don't know how long I stood there screaming. Eventually I ran, not toward where the creature had gone, obviously, but in the opposite direction, toward where I thought the path was. I ran like I've never run before or since, tripping over roots and branches, not caring about the scratches I was getting from low-hanging branches. I eventually found the path and followed it until I spotted my group near the pioneer cabin. They were all huddled around a counselor, working on solving a riddle. When they saw me, this wild-eyed, dirty, scratched-up kid running toward them screaming about a monster, everyone just froze. Sarah, my counselor, broke away from the group and ran to meet me. She crouched down to my level, put her hands on my shoulders, and asked what happened. I was crying so hard I could barely get the words out. I told her I saw something in the woods, something big and furry that looked almost like a person but wasn't. The look on her face. I'll never forget it. Not fear or belief, but this kind of pitying concern, like I was a little kid who'd had a nightmare. She told me it was probably just another camper playing a prank, or maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. But it wasn't. I know what bears look like. This was no bear. When I insisted, describing the creature's face, how it had looked at me with those intelligent eyes, she exchanged glances with the other counselor, this older guy named Mike, who always wore a baseball cap. That look said everything. Poor kid, she's hysterical. They took me back to the main building, gave me some juice, and had the camp nurse look at my scrapes. The nurse, this older lady with grey hair tied back in a bun, cleaned my cuts while asking me gentle questions about what I'd seen. Unlike the others, she didn't immediately dismiss my story. She just listened, nodding occasionally, without commenting one way or another. When I calmed down a bit, Sarah asked if I wanted to call my parents. I thought about it, but decided against it. What would I say? Mom, Dad, I saw Bigfoot. Please come get me. They'd either think I was making it up to go home early, or that I'd let my imagination run wild. So I stayed at camp. For the rest of that day, I refused to participate in any activities that involved going near the woods. I stuck to Sarah like glue, jumping at every sound. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside the windows made me pull my sleeping bag over my head. I kept imagining those dark, intelligent eyes peering in at me. The next morning I overheard Mike and Sarah talking in hushed tones outside the cabin. Mike was saying something about that Anderson kid and overactive imagination, and probably saw a moose or something. Sarah nodded, but then said something that surprised me. But did you notice how quiet it was in that section of woods yesterday? No birds or anything. Kind of weird. Mike just shrugged it off. Probably because all the kids were running around screaming for that game. Animals aren't stupid. I wanted to tell them that no, it was quiet before I screamed, that the unnatural silence was what made me look up in the first place, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. Later that day, I snuck away from the group during arts and crafts and went to find the camp director, this stern-looking man named Mr. Peterson, who wore these thick glasses and always had a clipboard. I thought maybe, as the person in charge, he'd take me seriously. I told him my story, trying to include every detail I could remember about the creature. When I finished, he took off his glasses, cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, and put them back on before speaking. "Lily," he said, using this voice adults use when they're trying to be patient with a child they think is being ridiculous. "Camp Alexo has been operating for over 30 years. If there was a Bigfoot living in these woods, don't you think someone would have seen it before now?" "Maybe they have," I said. "Maybe they just didn't tell anyone because they knew no one would believe them." He gave me this look, half amused, half concerned, and said he'd look into it. But I knew he wouldn't. To him, I was just an imaginative kid who got scared in the woods. The rest of the week passed without incident. I refused to participate in any more wide games and stayed close to the main buildings. The other kids started calling me Bigfoot Girl and making these stupid growling noises whenever I walked by. Even my bunkmates would tease me at night, making shadows with their flashlights and whispering, "Bigfoot's gonna get you." By the time my parents picked me up, I'd stopped talking about what I'd seen. It was easier to pretend it never happened than to face the ridicule. When my mom asked if I had fun, I just shrugged and said it was okay. I never went back to Camp Alexo. For years afterward, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I did see a bear. Maybe it was an unusually large man with a beard. Maybe I hit my head when I fell and hallucinated the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those eyes, that awareness, it wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. It was something in between. I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings since then, especially in Alberta. There have been other reports in that region, though not many public ones from Camp Alexo specifically. But camp staff change every year, and who knows what stories they keep to themselves. I'm a wildlife biologist now, if you can believe it. My encounter pushed me towards studying animals, trying to understand what else might be out there that we don't fully understand yet. I've never seen anything like that creature again, despite spending a lot of time in remote wilderness areas for my work. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too, that scared little 9-year-old girl in the woods. I wonder if it tells its own kind about the small, hairless creature it encountered one summer day, and if they believe its story. I know how crazy this all sounds. Most days, I still have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that day in the woods at Camp Alexo, and while I can't prove it, I can't unsee it either. Those eyes still find me in my dreams sometimes, not threatening, just watching, curious, intelligent, real.